Hello everyone, and welcome back to Little Nightmare. I'm Michael, and before we begin, I'd like to ask for a little support. Please subscribe, leave a like, and if you do, let me know in the comments where in the world you're listening from. These may seem like small gestures, but they're essential for helping the channel grow and allowing me to keep bringing you these stories every night. Now, lower the volume just a bit, get comfortable, turn off the lights, and let's dive together into tonight's first story. The first thing I remember is the wallpaper in the hallway. It was a pattern of deep forest green, with silver ferns unfurling in a repeating sequence that was meant to be soothing, I think. The kind of design that speaks of money and quiet taste. But on that first afternoon, as we stood in the grand foyer of the Overlook, our breath pluming in the cold air we had let in, I saw that the pattern was broken. Not torn or peeling, but altered. In one long stretch between the archway to the dining room and the door to the west wing, the ferns changed. Their silver fronds twisted into something else, something that looked more like skeletal fingers, long and thin, reaching for the floor. I stared at it until my mother's hand on my shoulder broke the spell. No one else seemed to notice. It was just a quirk of the printing, my father would later say, a flaw in the batch. But I knew, even then at 10 years old, that the house had already begun to speak to me, and its first word was a lie. My name is David. This was the winter of my 10th year. The winter the silence of the Overlook Hotel settled into our bones. We had come because my father, Julien, had taken the position of winter caretaker. The old hotel, a colossal monument of Gilded Age ambition perched on the shoulder of a Colorado mountain, closed its doors from October to May, buried under snow and isolation. My father's job was to run the boilers, manage the slow decay of emptiness, and keep the ghosts company. He said it would be an adventure, a chance for us to be a real family, away from the noise and the debts and the disappointed looks that had followed him from one failed endeavor to the next. My mother, Mariah, packed her worries in tissue paper and placed them in a mental trunk, but I could still see the shape of them beneath the lid. The hotel was not one building, but a collection of them. A sprawling complex of main structures and outbuildings, connected by covered breezeways that became tunnels of howling wind. The heart of it was the main lodge, 5 stories of timber and stone, with a roof of green copper, now patinated with a century of weather. Its windows were 1,000 dark eyes watching the pine forest that pressed in from all sides. Inside, it was a cathedral of forgotten luxury. A ballroom with a floor of polished maple, so vast that the sound of your footsteps was swallowed whole before it could return to you. A dining room with tables still set with white linen, the chairs upturned on them like a herd of sleeping cattle. A kitchen that was a cavern of cold steel and shadows. And the corridors, miles of them, carpeted in a deep wine-red Axminster that muffled all sound, so that you moved through the hotel as a ghost moves silently, leaving no trace. Our apartment was in the East Wing, a suite of rooms that felt both too large and too small. The windows looked out onto the great hedge maze, its leafless, snow-laden walls a labyrinth of frozen secrets. At night, the wind would find its way inside, not through the cracks in the windows, for they were tight, but through the very walls, a low, constant hum that was the hotel breathing. The first omen was a sound. It came a week after the last guest had left, and the management had departed, leaving us truly alone. I was in my room, trying to read, when I heard it. A faint, rhythmic thumping, like a heavy ball being bounced in a distant room. It was a hollow sound, a lonely sound. I followed it out into the hallway, past the twisted ferns on the wallpaper. The sound led me down the corridor, past closed doors, numbered in brass, then up a flight of stairs to the 3rd floor. It grew louder, this bump, 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 echoing in the deep silence. It seemed to be coming from behind room 317. I put my ear to the cool, varnished wood. The bouncing stopped, and then from the other side, a child's voice, whisper thin, asked, "Want to come play with us, Danny?" My blood turned to ice. No one had called me Danny since I was a toddler. It was a name I had left behind. I ran, my socks slipping on the red carpet, not stopping until I was back in our apartment, the smell of my mother's cooking. A mundane, beautiful smell of stewing beef and onions, anchoring me to reality. I told my father that night over a game of chess. The board was set up on a small table by the fire, the pieces carved of onyx and ivory, another relic of the hotel's past. He moved his knight, his hand trembling slightly. The light from the flames danced across his face, and for a moment, he looked ancient. "It's an old building, David," he said, his voice too loud for the quiet room. "It settles. The pipes knock. The wind gets into the vents and makes noises. It's your imagination filling in the blanks. There's no one here but us." But he was wrong. There was someone else. Or something. I had felt it from the moment we arrived, a pressure at the back of my mind, a faint buzzing static, like a television tuned to a dead channel. It was a feeling I'd had before, in other places, a sensitivity to things that were not quite there. I saw glimpses sometimes, out of the corner of my eye, a shadow detaching itself from a deeper shadow, a flicker of movement in a mirror. I learned not to mention them. My father's smile would become tight, a brittle thing that threatened to shatter. My mother would hug me a little too tightly, her fear a scent of lavender and cold sweat. The days bled into one another, a monochrome procession of snow and silence. The world outside our windows shrank until it was only the white veil of the storm and the dark shapes of the pines. My father's sanity began to erode, not in dramatic collapses, but in small, subtle chips, like flakes of paint falling from a once grand door. He would forget what he was saying mid-sentence, his eyes losing focus, staring at nothing. He developed a habit of licking his lips, a quick, nervous flick of the tongue. He started to spend his nights not in our apartment, but in the grand lobby, sitting in the high-backed chair behind the reception desk, as if he were the manager, awaiting guests who would never come. One morning, I found him in the ballroom. He was standing in the center of the vast empty floor, holding a croquet mallet from the game room. He was swinging it slowly, methodically, as if playing a game with an invisible partner. "They're expecting a party, David," he said without looking at me. His voice was a dry rustle. "We have to be ready. The standards must be maintained." The static in my head grew louder. I could feel a presence in the room with us, a cold, amused attention focused on my father. It was hungry. It fed on his fragility, sipping it like fine wine. My mother saw it, too. I would catch her watching him, her face a mask of quiet terror. She tried to pull him back, with a gentle touch, a soft word, a favorite meal. But he was receding from us, drifting into the deep waters of the Overlook. He began to speak of the hotel's previous caretaker, a man named Grady, who had, according to the scattered history my father had pieced together, gone mad one winter long ago and killed his family before turning the gun on himself. My father didn't say it with horror, but with a kind of grim understanding, as if Grady were a colleague he was finally coming to appreciate. The breaking point, or perhaps the point of no return, was the wasps. In the attic, a place of exposed beams and decades of dust, we found a nest. It was enormous, a gray, pulpy tumor clinging to the rafters. It should have been dormant in the cold, but as my father poked at it with a long stick, a few sluggish, winter-dulled wasps crawled out. He became obsessed. He saw the nest not as a remnant of summer, but as an infestation, a personal insult from the hotel. He spent days up there, armed with cans of insecticide, a bandana tied over his face, his eyes wild above it. He would come down reeking of poison and sweat, muttering about, cleansing the structure. It was around this time that the other one began to speak to me more clearly. Not the malevolent presence that was feasting on my father, but another voice, fainter, frayed at the edges with static and distance. It came to me in dreams or in the half-state between sleep and waking. His name was Douglas Ray. He was an old man, or had been, a caretaker from a much earlier time. He didn't speak in words so much as in images and feelings. He showed me a sunlit lawn, the hotel new and gleaming, and a woman in a white dress laughing. Then he showed me the same woman, her face a blue, bloated mask, floating in the swimming pool in the basement, the one that was now drained and littered with dead leaves. He showed me the things that lived in the overlook, the memories soaked into the wood and plaster. They were not ghosts in the traditional sense. They were echoes, recordings of strong emotion, terror, rage, jealousy, that played over and over again. And at the center of it all was a cold, intelligent hunger, a faceless thing that had been born from the accumulation of all that pain. It was the hotel itself, and it wanted us. It wanted a new family to join its collection. Douglas Ray's final message to me was a warning, a single, clear image. My father, standing over my mother's bed, the croquet mallet in his hand. That night, the storm that had been threatening for days finally broke. It was not a storm of nature, I am sure of it. It was the hotel, flexing its power. The wind screamed like a thing in agony, and the snow fell not in flakes, but in solid, horizontal sheets, burying us alive. The lights flickered, died, and did not come back on. We were left with the guttering light of the fire and the battery-powered lamps, islands of feeble light in an ocean of darkness. My father was gone from our apartment. My mother and I huddled together on the sofa, wrapped in blankets, listening to the fury outside. And then we heard it. A sound that cut through the wind. A steady, rhythmic thumping. Bump, bump, bump. It was coming from the hallway. It was the sound of a ball being bounced. My mother's hand tightened on mine. "Julian?" she called out, her voice a thin, frayed thread. The bouncing stopped. Silence, deeper and more profound than any sound, filled the space. Then, the doorknob to our apartment began to turn. Slowly, deliberately. It was unlocked. The door swung open. My father stood there. He was silhouetted against the dim, red emergency light of the corridor, but I could see his face. It was my father's face, but the man I knew was gone. His eyes were wide, vacant pools, and a small, placid smile played on his lips. In his right hand, he held the croquet mallet, resting it on his shoulder like a baseball bat. "Honey," he said to my mother, his voice a reasonable, conversational tone that was more terrifying than any scream. "The management has received a complaint about the noise from this unit. We're going to have to ask you to keep it down." My mother began to cry. Soft, hopeless sobs. "Julian, please. It's me. It's Mariah. And David." He took a step into the room. The static in my head was a deafening roar now. I could feel the other presence in the room with us, a cold weight in the air, watching, waiting. It was enjoying this. "There's no David here," my father said, his head cocking to the side. "Just the boy, the noisy boy." He took another step, his eyes fixed on me. "The one who shines so brightly. He's been disturbing the other guests." I did the only thing I could think of. I reached out with my mind, not to my father, but to the thing that was using him. I pushed against it. I showed it the image Douglas Ray had given me, the woman in the white dress, floating in the pool. I showed it the skeletal fingers on the wallpaper, the hollow bounce of the ball, the empty eyes of Grady's children. I showed it its own hunger, its own emptiness. For a fraction of a second, my father faltered. The placid smile twitched. A flicker of confusion, of pain, crossed his features. The mallet lowered an inch. "Sorry," he mumbled. "We have to get ready for the party." And in that moment of weakness, my mother moved. She didn't scream. She didn't attack. She simply stood up, walked to him, and placed her hands on his cheeks. She looked directly into his haunted eyes. "Julien," she whispered, her voice as steady as stone. "Come back to me." It was like a spell breaking. The malevolent presence recoiled, its attention snapping away from us with a psychic shriek of frustration. The static in my head vanished, leaving a ringing silence. My father's eyes cleared. He looked at the mallet in his hand as if he had never seen it before. It clattered to the floor. He looked at my mother's face, at her tears, and his own face crumpled. He sank to his knees, sobbing, clutching her around the waist. We left the overlook at first light, when the storm had abated to a gentle snowfall. We didn't pack. We just walked out, got into our snow-crusted car, and prayed it would start. It did. We drove down the mountain, away from that place, and we never went back. My father never fully recovered. The man he was had been hollowed out, and something of the overlooked silence remained in him forever. But he was gentle, and he was sorry, and he loved my mother until the day he died. And me? I carry it with me too. Not the terror, not anymore. That has faded, like a photograph left in the sun. What remains is the memory of that vast, empty hotel, standing alone in the snow. Its windows dark, its halls silent. I think of the things that are still in there, the echoes of laughter and screams, the bouncing ball in an empty room, the cold, patient hunger waiting for the next family to arrive, the next winter to fall. I see it sometimes in my dreams, a palace of loneliness and memory, growing older and wiser and hungrier with every passing year. The images are soft now, blurred at the edges, the colors muted. The grand lobby is a smudge of gold and red, the hedge maze a swirl of white and green. My father's face a pale, smiling moon in the darkness. It all recedes, slower and slower, until it is just a single dark point on the horizon of my mind. And then, like a dream upon waking, it is gone. The car heater whined, struggling against the deep cold that had seeped into our very clothes. No one spoke for the first hour of the descent. The tires crunched through the fresh powder, the only sound in a world wiped clean and white. I sat in the back seat, watching the trees slide past, their branches heavy with snow. My father's hands were tight on the steering wheel, his knuckles white. He stared straight ahead, as if afraid to look in the rearview mirror. My mother reached over and placed her hand on his forearm, and he flinched just slightly before covering her hand with his own. We did not go home, because home was a small apartment in Boulder filled with bills and the ghost of my father's failures. Instead, we drove to my mother's sister's house in Denver. Aunt Carol asked no questions when we appeared on her doorstep, hollow-eyed and carrying nothing. She just pulled my mother into a tight embrace and ushered us inside. The normality of her house was a shock. The smell of coffee and lemon polish, the drone of a daytime television show, the bright floral patterns on the sofa cushions. It was all so loud, so garishly alive. We never spoke of the overlook. It became the unspoken thing, the void around which our new family orbit was carefully arranged. My father found work as a night watchman at a warehouse, a job that required silence and solitude, the very things that had broken him. He was a quiet, careful man after that. The boisterous dreamer was gone, replaced by someone who jumped at sudden noises and preferred to sit in a room with all the lights on. He and my mother loved each other, but it was a love built on the careful management of a shared injury. I grew up. The boy who was called Danny receded into the past, along with the static in my head. The shine, as the thing in the hotel had called it, faded. Or perhaps I just learned to ignore it, to tune it out like a distant radio station. I went to college, studied architecture of all things. I was drawn to the logic of blueprints, the strength of load-bearing walls, The idea that a space could be designed for light and warmth and human connection. But sometimes in the dead of night, or in the quiet moment between waking and sleep, a memory would surface, unbidden. Not of my father with the mallet, or the voice from room 317, but of the sheer immense loneliness of the place. I would remember standing in the center of the ballroom, feeling the weight of all that empty space above me, and a longing would ache in my chest, a terrible, incomprehensible longing to hear just one note of music, to see one couple waltzing across that vast floor. It was the hotel's loneliness I felt, not my own. It had gotten inside me, and a tiny piece of it had remained. Years later, after my father had passed and my mother had moved to a smaller place, I received a package. It was from a historical society in Colorado. They were compiling an archive on the great mountain hotels, and had found my father's name in the employment records of the Overlook. They asked if I had any photographs or memorabilia from that winter. Enclosed was a single grainy black and white photograph they had unearthed. It was a staff photograph from the 1920s. Rows of men in crisp white jackets and women in dark dresses stood on the steps of the main lodge. My eyes were drawn not to the smiling faces in the front, but to a figure at the very back, standing in the deep shadow of the portico. He was an older man in a caretaker's uniform, his face blurred and indistinct, but I knew him. His name was Douglas Ray, and standing just beside him, barely visible, was a young boy holding a croquet mallet. The boy was not looking at the camera. He was looking directly at me. I put the photograph away in a drawer. I did not respond to the Historical Society. Some stories are not meant to be archived. Some places are better left to the silence and the snow. I know the Overlook is still there. I feel it, sometimes. On a cold winter night when the wind sounds a certain way. A dark shape on the mountain, waiting, its windows like closed eyes, dreaming of the next family that might come to stay, and never leave. The photograph stayed in that drawer for a decade, a secret I carried from one apartment to another. A dark seed in a filing cabinet or a box in the closet. My life moved forward, a linear path of promotions and quiet relationships that never quite took root. I designed buildings that were praised for their warmth and humanity, a conscious rebellion against the cold, grasping architecture of my past. I was successful by all external measures, but the work felt like a performance. A careful imitation of a man who was not haunted. The dreams began again in my 40s. Not the violent, terrifying dreams of my childhood, but something subtler and more insidious. I would dream I was simply walking the corridors of the Overlook, not as a child, but as the man I was. The carpets were threadbare, the wallpaper peeling, but it was all still there. I would wake with the taste of old dust in my mouth, and a profound sense of loss, as if I had misplaced something vital. The hotel was calling me back, not with a shout, but with a sigh. It was a business trip that finally brought me to Colorado. A convention in Denver. The mountains were a purple bruise on the horizon, and every time I looked at them, the pull intensified. On the last day of the trip, I rented a car. I told myself I was just going for a drive to see the autumn colors. But my hands on the wheel knew the way, as if the route were a map etched on my bones. The road up the mountain was narrower than I remembered, the turns sharper. The Overlook was not on any modern map, but I found the old, overgrown access road. I parked where the snow had stopped our car all those years ago, and walked the final mile. The air was thin and cold, and the only sound was the crunch of my boots on the gravel and the frantic beating of my own heart. And then I saw it. The Overlook. It was a ruin. The main lodge was a blackened skeleton, victim of a long-ago fire. The roof had caved in, and the grand windows were empty sockets staring out at the sky. Weeds and saplings grew through the cracked terrace. The hedge maze was a wild, untamed thicket. It was dead. It was finally, truly dead. I felt a staggering rush of relief, so powerful it brought me to my knees on the gravel. The weight of decades lifted from my shoulders. It was over. The monster had been slain by time and neglect. I laughed, a raw, broken sound in the immense silence. I walked through the corpse of the hotel, through gaps in the walls where doors had been. The ballroom was open to the elements, the floor a mosaic of rotten moss. The lobby was a charred pit, the reception desk a pile of ash and twisted metal. I stood where my father had sat in his madness, and I felt nothing but the chill of the mountain air. I was about to leave, my pilgrimage complete, when a glint of something caught my eye. Half buried in the blackened debris near the fireplace was a single, intact object. I knelt and brushed away the soot and dirt. It was the onyx king from our chess set. The piece was cool and smooth in my hand, a perfect black little relic. And as my fingers closed around it, the static returned. It was a faint whisper at first, a hiss at the very edge of my hearing. Then it grew, not to the deafening roar of my childhood, but to a clear, coherent signal. It was not the voice of Douglas Ray, nor the hungry presence. It was the hotel itself. Its voice was the sound of settling timber, the sigh of the wind through broken beams, the patient, mineral silence of the mountain. "You came back," it said, not in words, but in a wave of cold satisfaction. "I knew you would. You are part of the collection." I dropped the chess piece as if it had burned me. I understood then. The fire, the decay, it was all just a change of costume. The thing that was the overlook had never lived in the wood and plaster. It lived in the land, in the memory of the place. It was a pattern, a story that demanded to be told and retold. My father had been a character in that story. I was another. By coming back, I had given it the one thing it needed most, an ending and a beginning. I turned and ran, not from a monster, but from an idea. I ran back to the car and drove, and I did not look back. I live my life now in a city of millions, surrounded by noise and light. I am an old man, but sometimes, on a still night, I take out that onyx king, which I inexplicably pocketed before I fled. I hold it in my hand, and I feel the cold, patient weight of the mountain. I know it is still there waiting, not for me, but for the next one who shines. The story is not over. It is simply waiting for the next page to be turned. The Onyx King sits on my desk, a paperweight for a life of unanswered questions. My own children are grown, scattered across the country, their lives bright and noisy and blessedly normal. They know nothing of the Overlook, only that their grandfather was a quiet man, and that I have a strange fondness for keeping all the lights on in the house. They think it is an old man's quirk. They do not understand it is a bulwark. My wife, Clara, a practical woman with a laugh that can fill a room, sometimes asks me about the black chess piece. I tell her it is a reminder of my father. This is not a lie, but it is not the whole truth. The whole truth is that I am its keeper. As long as I hold it, I feel a certain responsibility is met. A vigil is kept. I am the one who remembers, and in remembering, I contain it. Last night, I woke to the sound of a ball bouncing. Bump, bump, butter. It was not in a dream. It was in the hallway, just outside my bedroom door. My heart seized in my chest, a cold fist clenching. Clara slept soundly beside me. I lay there, paralyzed, listening to the rhythmic hollow sound. I knew if I opened the door, there would be nothing there, just an empty, dark hallway. But the sound was real. It was a message, a receipt. This morning, I found the Onyx King on the floor. It had rolled from my desk to the exact center of the room. I picked it up. It was colder than the room, colder than it should have been. I held it in my palm until it warmed to my body temperature, a small daily ritual of defiance. I have decided to write it all down. Not for a historical society, not for publication, but for the next one. My grandson, Leo, is 8. He has my eyes. And sometimes, when he is quiet, I see a flicker of something behind them. A brightness that is more than just intelligence. He is a quiet boy, thoughtful. He loves stories. When he visits, he always asks about the black chess piece. I have never told him anything, but I will. I will write it all down and leave the manuscript for him, with the onyx king placed carefully on top. It will be a warning and a weapon. Knowledge is the only defense against a story that wants to be told. The overlook is a pattern, and patterns repeat, but they can be broken. I have to believe that. It is the only thing that keeps me from hearing the wind as anything but the wind. He will be here this afternoon. I can hear Clara in the kitchen, humming as she prepares lunch, a simple, domestic sound that usually brings me peace. Today, it feels thin, a fragile curtain against the immense quiet that has gathered in my study. The manuscript is complete, a stack of pages filled with my shaky handwriting. It is the truth, as I remember it. I have placed the Onyx King on the title page. It looks like a period, a full stop to a sentence that should have ended long ago. I can feel the pressure in the air changing, the way it did before a storm on the mountain. It is not a physical storm coming, but a confluence, a turning of the page. Leo will read this, and he will know. He will be armed. He will not be a lonely child in a cavernous place, bewildered by the static in his head. He will have a map of the monster's territory. The doorbell rings. Clara's footsteps patter to the front door, and her cheerful greeting is followed by the bright, eager voice of my grandson. I take a deep breath, the air tasting of old books and dust and a faint, cold electricity. I stand, my bones protesting, and I look down at the story I have written. It is no longer just my story. It is about to become his. I open the study door and step out into the light of the hallway, ready to welcome him, ready to pass the weight of the Black King from my hand. And finally, after all these years, let it go. The hallway was so bright, the sun streaming through the front window and catching the dust motes dancing in the air. Leo stood there, shrugging off his little backpack, his face lighting up when he saw me. "Grandpa," he said, and the sound was so ordinary, so wonderfully real. Clara smiled at me from behind him, her eyes crinkling at the corners, unaware of the ledger I was about to open. We ate lunch first. I made myself participate in the chatter, asking Leo about school, about his friends, about the comic book he was reading. I watched his hands as he talked, so certain, and a terrible love and fear warred within me. I was about to change his world. I was about to give him a key to a door that should remain forever locked. After lunch, I told him I had a special story for him, one I'd written down just for him. His curiosity was immediate, a spark in those clear, intelligent eyes. He followed me into the study, a room he usually found boring, filled with old books and blueprints. His gaze went straight to the desk, to the stack of paper and the black chess piece resting on top. "Is that the story?" he asked, pointing. "It is," I said, my voice rougher than I intended. "And this." I picked up the Onyx King. It felt heavier than ever, a dense little knot of cold. "This is part of the story. I want you to have it." He reached for it, his small fingers closing around it. He didn't flinch at its temperature. He just looked at it, turning it over in his hand, his expression one of serious contemplation. "It's a king," he stated. "It is," I said. "And kings have great power, but they also have great responsibilities and great dangers." I gestured to the manuscript. "This book will explain it all. It's not a happy story, Leo. It's a true one. And it's a warning. You don't have to read it today. You can wait until you're older. He looked from the chess piece to the pages and then back to me. There was no fear in his face, only a profound and unsettling understanding. "It's okay, Grandpa," he said softly. "I think I'm supposed to read it." The phrase, "supposed to," sent a chill straight through me. He felt it too. The pull of the narrative, the gravity of the pattern. He sat down in my worn leather chair, the manuscript on his lap, the king held tightly in his left hand. He opened to the first page and began to read. I left him there. I couldn't watch. I went into the living room and sat with Clara, who was reading a novel. The silence from my study was absolute. It was the most agonizing hour of my life. I was waiting for a cry, a gasp, for him to run out frightened. But he did not. When he finally emerged, he was pale, but composed. He held the manuscript neatly in one hand and the Onyx King in the other. He walked up to me and put his arms around my neck in a tight hug. He didn't say anything. He just held on. And in that silence, I felt it. The weight was not gone, but it was shared. The story was his now, too. The vigil had a new participant. The pattern had been acknowledged, and in that acknowledgement, perhaps its power was already beginning to change. He let go and looked at me, and for the first time, I saw not a flicker, but a steady, determined light in his eyes. He was not afraid. He was prepared. He put the manuscript and the chess piece carefully into his backpack. When his mother came to pick him up, he was just a boy again, chattering about the cool story his grandpa had given him. I watched from the doorway as their car pulled away, a strange emptiness opening inside me. I had carried the burden for so long that its absence felt like a new kind of weight. That night, for the first time in years, I slept deeply and without dreams. There was no bouncing ball, no whisper of static. There was only a quiet, profound silence. I woke feeling older than ever, but lighter. Clara remarked on it over coffee, saying I looked like I'd finally gotten a good night's rest. I simply smiled and agreed. A week later, Leo called. His voice was quiet, serious. "Grandpa," he said, "I finished the story. I've read it 3 times. I waited, my heart a dull thud in my chest. I understand," he continued. "I won't go to places like that, and I'll be careful with the shine." He paused, and I could almost hear him thinking, "The king is safe." I put him on my bookshelf, next to my favorite stories. It was the right thing to do. He was integrating it, making it a part of his world, but not letting it dominate. He was already handling it better than I ever had. The seasons turned. My life settled into a gentler rhythm. The memory of the Overlook began to feel more like a story I had once read, and less like a ghost living in my blood. I started to believe that I had truly passed it on, that the chain was broken. Then, this morning, the email arrived. It was from Leo. The subject line was simply, "Look what I found." Attached was a digital scan of an old, faded newspaper clipping from his local library's archive. The headline read, "Local couple purchases historic mountain estate, plans restoration." The article was about a young family, the Haldorns, who had bought a long-abandoned property called the Black Peak Lodge. It was in a different range, hundreds of miles from the Overlook. The photograph showed a sprawling, gabled structure of dark timber, its windows boarded up. It looked nothing like the Overlook, and yet everything like it. The caption below the photo noted the previous owner, a reclusive caretaker named Douglas Ray, who had vanished decades ago. My breath caught in my throat. It was a different name, a different mountain, but it was the same story. The pattern was not just repeating. It was evolving, finding new ground, a new stage for its old play. Leo had added a single line of text below the scanned image. His words were calm, resolute, and they filled me with a terrifying pride. "I'm watching them, Grandpa," he wrote. "I'm already watching them." The vigil was his now, and he was not just a keeper. He was a sentinel. I read his email 3 times, each time feeling the old cold seeping back into my bones. It was not coincidence. There are no coincidences with things like this. The story had found a new conduit, a new telling, and my grandson, my bright, brave Leo, had stepped directly into its path. He was not running. He was walking toward it, his eyes wide open. I rode back. I told him to be careful, to be so careful. I told him that watching was one thing, but intervening was another. I told him that the story is hungry, and it loves a hero. He replied almost instantly, "I know, but someone has to. And I have the map you gave me." He has the map. He has the king. He has the shine. He has everything he needs to be a perfect protagonist, and the thought terrifies me more than any ghost ever could. I look at the chess piece on my desk, the one I thought I had given away. It is still here. I realize now that Leo must have found a duplicate, a perfect match, and left it for me as a comfort. Or perhaps the original simply found its way back, a token refusing to leave the game. Clara calls me for dinner. Her voice is warm, a tether to a world of simple things. I go to her, I sit at the table, I taste the food. But my mind is on a different mountain, in a different state, where a young family is unpacking their boxes in a lodge with a dark past. And I am here, an old man in a brightly lit room, listening, not for a bouncing ball, but for the phone to ring, waiting for the call that I know will come, the one where my grandson's voice, trying to be brave, will tell me that the static has started to whisper his name. The story continues. It always continues. And all I can do is wait and hope that the sentinel I created is strong enough to withstand the coming storm. Story 2. The grand foyer of the Opéra de la Lune Noire was a cavern of guilt and shadow, a space that seemed to breathe with a life of its own. On certain evenings, beneath the cold gaze of 1,000 crystal teardrops in the chandelier, the marble floor would feel as vast and lonely as a frozen lake, the ceiling a distant, starless sky. On others, the walls appeared to press inward, the gold-leaf cherubs leaning a little too close, their plaster smiles tinged with a suffocating intimacy. It was never quite the same, this feeling of scale, and those who worked there had long grown accustomed to the subtle, unsettling shifts in proportion, as one grows accustomed to a chronic pain. They simply adjusted their pace, averted their eyes from the more persistent shadows, and went about the business of creating beauty. Into this ancient, breathing organism came Amy. She was a sparrow of a girl, with hair the color of dust and eyes that held the gray of a sea fog. Her voice, however, was not a sparrow's. It was a thing of impossible silver and light, a clear, soaring instrument that seemed to catch in the high arches of the theater and spin there, defying gravity. She was a member of the chorus, a face in a sea of faces, but her sound was a solitary bell in a cacophony of noise. It was this sound that first drew him out. He was a rumor, a sigh in the walls, a name spoken only in the hushed tones reserved for blasphemy or ghost stories. The Phantom of the Opéra de la Lune Noire. The performers spoke of misplaced sheet music that would reappear with corrections of such genius. They felt like revelations. The stagehands muttered about tools left in one spot and found in another, and of a faint, sweet odor of dust and decay that would sometimes permeate a corridor before vanishing, as if it had never been. He was the reason no one went down to the 5th cellar level, a warren of forgotten storage rooms and bricked-up passageways that sat below even the great water-filled chamber that housed the hydraulic stage machinery. It was said his lair was down there, in the deepest, oldest belly of the opera house. Amy first heard him as a breath of sound against her ear while she practiced alone in a small, dusty rehearsal room. It was not a voice. Not at first. It was a hum, a resonance that seemed to tune the very air around her, correcting the slight tremor in her vibrato, guiding her breath into a longer, more sustained line. She was not afraid. The attention felt like a benediction. Then came the notes, slipped under her door on paper that was brittle and yellowed. The musical notation penned in a sharp, frantic hand. The compositions were unlike anything she had ever seen. Melodies that coiled and twisted into strange, beautiful shapes. Harmonies that spoke of ancient, sorrowful things. Under his secret tutelage, Amy blossomed. From a chorister, she was given a solo. From a soloist, she was given a principal role. Her fame began to spread beyond the opera house walls. The other performers watched her with a mixture of awe and suspicion. They saw how she would sometimes pause backstage, her head tilted as if listening to a distant conversation. They saw the strange, knowing smile that would sometimes touch her lips. They knew she was being touched by the ghost, and they were afraid for her, or perhaps afraid what she was becoming. It was during this ascent that Benny, the new first violinist, fell in love with her. He was all sunlight and solidity, with warm hands and a laugh that echoed genuinely in the high spaces. He represented a world outside the opera's gilded cage, a world of cafes and daylight and simple affections. He began to court her with a gentle persistence, bringing her coffee, walking her home through the lamplit streets. Amy, starved for a normal kind of warmth, found herself drawn to him. His love felt like a safe harbor, a promise of a life unhaunted. This was the spark that ignited a cold, deep-seated fire in the dark. The phantom's guidance, once so gentle, turned possessive. The notes slid under her door became more frequent, more demanding. The hum in her ear during practice sessions grew sharper, more insistent. One night, as she sang a particularly haunting aria, a backdrop high above the stage came loose and crashed down, missing her by inches. The stagehands found the rigging rope frayed, as if chewed by something patient and determined. It was perhaps an accident, a simple failure of aged equipment, but everyone knew. It was a warning. The tension accumulated like a pressure drop before a storm. Whispers became certainties. The sweet smell of decay was noticed more often, lingering in Amy's dressing room, clinging to her costumes. Benny, concerned for her safety, began to ask questions. He sought out the oldest members of the orchestra, the most grizzled stagehands, piecing together the legend of the Phantom. He learned of the fifth cellar, of the stories of a man, a musical genius, horribly disfigured, who had built parts of the opera house and never left. Benny's love for Amy curdled into a fierce, protective resolve. He would unmask this specter. He would break its hold on her. The revelation came on the night of Amy's greatest performance, the lead in a new opera, a piece that was itself rumored to have been composed by the Phantom. The house was packed, the air thick with anticipation. As Amy began her final devastating aria, a single, pure note of sorrow that held the entire audience captive, a figure emerged from the shadows of the proscenium arch. It was not a ghost. It was a man, tall and gaunt, draped in a black cloak, his face hidden behind a white porcelain mask that was expressionless, save for the faintest hint of a tragic smile painted upon it. He moved with an unnatural grace, a part of the darkness itself. He walked towards Amy as she sang, his presence silencing the orchestra without a command. The audience sat, frozen, believing it all to be part of the show. Benny, watching from the orchestra pit, felt his blood turn to ice. He saw the way the masked figure looked at Amy, not with the admiration of an audience, but with the terrifying, absolute possession of a creator for his masterpiece. As the final note of her aria faded into a stunned silence, the Phantom reached for her. That was when Benny moved. He vaulted onto the stage, placing himself between Amy and the cloaked figure. "Leave her alone," he said, his voice ringing in the quiet. The masked head tilted. A sound emerged from behind the porcelain, not a shout, but a low, resonant whisper that seemed to crawl into the ears of everyone present. "She is mine. I made her." What followed was not a fight, but a tragedy of errors and terror. Benny lunged. The phantom moved with a speed that was not human, a swirl of black cloth. There was a struggle, a blur of motion near the edge of the stage, a cry from Amy that was ripped from her throat. And then Benny was falling backward into the dark space of the orchestra pit. The sound of his body meeting the unyielding wood and brass below was a wet, final crack that broke the spell of silence in the theater. In the chaos and screaming that erupted, the phantom vanished. Amy stood alone at the center of the stage, the spotlight making a ghost of her, her hands stained with a terror she could not name. The authorities came, of course. They searched the fifth cellar. They found the lair. A room furnished with strange elegance, a bed shaped like a coffin, a pipe organ whose keys were worn smooth, and everywhere, the compositions, mountains of them, all in that same frantic hand. But they found no trace of the phantom. He had melted back into the stone and mortar of the building, a sigh returning to the lungs of the opera house. Amy never sang again. She left the Opéra de la Lune Noire and disappeared into the mundane world, a gray woman haunted by a silver song she could no longer voice. The opera house continued as such places do. The show, as they say, must go on. New singers rose to fame. New rumors were born. But sometimes, late at night, a stagehand or a cleaner working alone would report a strange thing. They would hear, very faintly, as if from a great distance, the sound of a man weeping. And if they listened very closely, they might just make out the words, whispered on the edge of hearing, a voice fading between words, leaving the last sentence unfinished, a plea lost to the stones. It is the silence after that is the most terrible, a silence that feels like an answer. For the phantom, the victory was a kind of death. He had eliminated the sun, but in doing so, he had extinguished the last of the light that reflected onto him. Amy was gone, and with her, the reason for his existence. The music in his head, once a glorious raging symphony, was now a single repeating note of despair. He roamed the lower levels, a king in a kingdom of dust and memory. His world shrunk to the confines of his own exquisite torture. He would sit for hours before his organ, his masked face reflected in the dark, polished wood, his hands hovering over the keys, unable to press down. The very act of creation was now a monument to his loss. He began to haunt a different part of the opera house, drawn not to the stages or the practice rooms, but to the small, grimy window in a storage closet on the second floor that looked out over a narrow side street. It was the street Amy had walked down with the violinist. He would stand there for entire nights, motionless, watching the lamplight pool on the cobblestones, waiting for a ghost that never came. He was punishing himself with the memory of her ordinary life, a life he had violently severed. One evening, a year to the day after the fall, a figure paused under that very lamp. It was a woman, her shoulders hunched against a light rein, her face obscured by a plain bonnet. But he knew the slope of her neck, the way she held herself even in dejection. It was Amy. She stood there for a long time, simply looking at the back wall of the opera house, as if trying to see through the stone. He pressed his forehead against the cold glass, his breath fogging a small circle. He did not move, did not dare to breathe. He was a statue of longing. She did not try to enter. After what felt like an eternity, she turned and walked away, her figure swallowed by the mist and the dark. That was the last time he saw her, but it was enough. Her return, however brief, was a key that unlocked something in him. It was not forgiveness, and it was not hope. It was a final grim understanding. His love was a poison, and his absence was the only antidote he could ever give her. The weeping in the walls stopped. The scent of dust and decay faded from the corridors. The sheet music remained where it was left. The Opéra de la Lune Noire began to feel, for the first time in living memory, like just a building. It was grand, it was old, it was sometimes drafty, but it was no longer a living, breathing entity. Chronic pain was gone, and the people who worked there slowly forgot the precise quality of the ache. Decades later, during a renovation of the fifth cellar, workers broke through a wall that had been sealed for a century. In the small, airless chamber behind it, they found a skeleton. It was seated at a small makeshift desk, its head resting on its arms as if in sleep. It was not surrounded by treasures or musical scores, only dust. On the desk lay a single, perfectly preserved object, a white porcelain mask. There was no hint of a smile painted on it anymore, just a smooth, empty white shell. The foreman, a practical man with no time for ghost stories, ordered the remains taken away for a pauper's burial. The mask he pocketed, thinking it a curious trinket. But that night, alone in his lodgings, he found he could not bring himself to look at it for long. There was a silence in its blankness that felt heavier than any sound. A final, unanswered note that hung in the air of the room long after he had locked it away in a drawer. The drawer remained locked for a week. The foreman, a man named Claude, found his sleep troubled by dreams of vast, dark spaces and a single sustained note that seemed to originate from inside his own chest. He was not a superstitious man. He dealt in brick and mortar, in the weight of stone and the surety of a level. But the mask exerted a gravitational pull on his thoughts. It was an object that should not exist in his world of ledgers and lunch pails. Finally, on a rainy Sunday, driven by a need to break its spell, he took it out. He placed it on his kitchen table, the rough wood a stark contrast to its eerie finish. He expected to feel a chill, perhaps a whisper of the past. Instead, he felt a profound and unsettling emptiness. It was not the absence of a person, but the absence of a universe. He picked it up, turning it over in his work-calloused hands. There were no markings, no clues to its origin. On an impulse he could not explain, he raised it to his own face. The world narrowed to two small eye holes. The sounds of the rain outside and the ticking of the clock became distant, muffled. He felt a sudden, vertiginous sense of isolation, as if he were looking out from a place of permanent exile. He tore it off, his heart hammering, and threw it back into the drawer, slamming it shut. He could not, however, bring himself to sell it or throw it away. It felt like an act of disrespect to a story he did not understand, but whose weight he could now feel. He eventually placed it in a small wooden box, which he buried in the foundation of a new bank building his crew was erecting across the city. He thought, with a kind of grim satisfaction, that he was entombing it in the most mundane and soulless structure he could imagine, a fortress against the strange and the sorrowful. Meanwhile, the opera house, freed from its phantom, flourished in a new era of electric light and roaring crowds. It became a monument to entertainment, its past tragedies polished into charming anecdotes for the guided tours. But the building itself had a long memory. On the rarest of nights, when a particular chord was struck by the orchestra, or a soprano of exceptional talent held a high C, the oldest stagehands would swear they felt a subtle shift in the air. The grand foyer would, for a fleeting moment, feel vast and lonely as a frozen lake once more, and the gold-leaf cherubs would seem to lean in, their plaster smiles knowing a secret that the bright, modern world had long forgotten. It was not a haunting, not anymore. It was simply an echo, a scar on the air, the indelible mark of a love that had been as destructive as it was divine, and a silence that was its only possible end. The story of the mask's final interment did not die with Claude. He told his son, a quiet boy with an engineer's mind, on his own deathbed, not as a ghost story, but as a cautionary tale about the weight that objects can carry. The son, in turn, passed the story to his daughter, a woman named Elodie, who worked as an archivist at the city library. She was a collector of fragments, a piecer together of lost histories. The story of the mask and the phantom of the Opéra de la Lune Noire became her private obsession. She began to spend her evenings in the library's basement, sifting through crumbling playbills, architectural plans, and the personal letters of long-dead patrons. She found the name Aimee, a chorus member promoted to star, her career ending abruptly after a single legendary performance. She found a brief, sensational news clipping about the tragic death of a violinist named Benoit. She even found a single sheet of music, tucked into a ledger of set designs, its notation a frantic, beautiful scrawl that made her heart ache for reasons she could not name. She was assembling a ghost, not from ectoplasm and rumor, but from paper and ink and silence. One night, she found it. A small, leather-bound diary, miscatalogued among the effects of a former mayor. It was the journal of a stagehand, and in it, he described in plain, unvarnished prose the discovery in the fifth cellar. He wrote of the skeleton, not as a monster, but as a man who had simply given up. The final entry was about the mask. He described its emptiness, its perfect, terrible whiteness, and he wrote of his own part in its disposal, a secret he had kept from the foreman. He had not, in fact, buried it in the bank foundation. Troubled by the same unease that would later haunt Claude, he had taken it upon himself to return it. On his way to the construction site, he had detoured to the opera house and, using his old key, had slipped inside. He had gone not to the fifth cellar, but to the very spot where it had all ended. He had placed the mask, carefully, almost reverently, on the floor of the orchestra pit, in the exact place where the violinist had fallen. Then he had left, and never spoken of it again. Elodie sat back, the diary trembling in her hands. The mask was never in the bank. It was there in the opera house, all along. She left the library as it was closing, the night air cool on her face. She walked the familiar route to the Opéra de la Lune Noire, its domed roof pale in the moonlight. A performance was letting out, and the grand foyer was filled with laughing, chattering people. She moved against the tide, slipping through a side door used by staff, her archivist's pass granting her easy access. The main auditorium was empty, the great red velvet seats like a field of sleeping beasts. The stage was dark, the curtain closed. She made her way down into the orchestra pit, the space cramped and shadowy. She used the light from her phone, sweeping it across the scuffed wooden floor. She didn't know what she was looking for, or if she would find anything at all. It had been decades. Then she saw it. Not the mask itself, but its impression. A near-perfect outline, a slightly different shade on the old wood. As if something had lain there for so long, it had bleached the surrounding area. It was a faint, pale ghost of a shape, the shape of a face that was no face. She knelt and reached out, not to touch, but to feel the air above it. It was cold, a profound, deep cold that had nothing to do with the drafty room. And in that cold, she felt it. Not a sound, not a whisper, but a cessation. It was the silence the foreman had felt, the silence after the final, unanswered note. It was the silence of a story that had reached its end, not with a bang, but with the slow, patient settling of dust. The phantom was gone, truly gone. The mask was gone. All that remained was this negative space, this echo of an echo. Elodie stayed there for a long time, a historian in the presence of the only truth that mattered, the truth written not in words or music, but in absence. Then she stood, turned off her light, and walked away, leaving the silence to its perfect, uninterrupted reign. The renovation of the orchestra pit began the following spring. The management had decided it was time for a new hydraulic system to elevate the musicians. The workmen, with their power tools and pragmatic noise, tore up the old floorboards. They found nothing of note beneath them, only compacted earth and the forgotten detritus of a century of performances. A broken violin string, a single pearl earring, a tarnished coin. They never noticed the faint pale outline on the back of one of the planks they ripped out and tossed into a dumpster. It was hauled away with the rest of the debris, crushed and incinerated. Elodie read about the renovation in the newspaper. She felt a quiet, final click, like the turning of a key in a lock deep inside her. She closed the file on the Opéra de la Lune Noire for the last time, her curiosity now replaced with a serene certainty. The story was over. The physical evidence was gone. All that was left was the tale itself, and she was its sole, complete keeper. She began to write, not a historical paper, but a novel. She poured every fragment, every sensation, every echo of cold silence into its pages. She wrote of the music that could drive a soul mad with its beauty, of a love that was a cage, of a silence that was louder than any sound. When it was published, it became a quiet success, praised for its atmospheric depth. Readers wrote to her, saying they could almost hear the phantom music, that they had felt a chill while reading the final chapters. They were feeling the echo she had preserved. The opera house, modernized and bright, continued its successful run. But on the opening night of a new avant-garde production, the lead tenor, a man known for his powerful voice, stepped forward for his solo. As he drew breath, a malfunction in the new hydraulic system caused the floor of the orchestra pit to emit a low, resonant groan. The sound was deep and mournful, a bass note of pure melancholy that vibrated through the soles of every shoe in the auditorium. It lasted only a second before the system was cut. The tenor hesitated, lost his place for a moment, and then continued. The audience assumed it was a technical error. But a few, the ones who had read a certain book, felt a different explanation. They felt it was the house itself, giving one last soft sigh for the ghost it could no longer hold. A final, physical memory of a sorrow so deep it had seeped into the very grain of the wood and the heart of the stone, waiting for the right moment to be heard one last time. The memory of that sound lingered in the building like a change in barometric pressure. It was not heard again, but it was felt. The new avant-garde production was a critical success. Yet stagehands reported that the new hydraulic lift in the orchestra pit was always cold to the touch, no matter the temperature backstage. They joked about it, a nervous, superficial laughter that did not reach their eyes. Elodie, for her part, never returned to the opera house. She had given the story its form, and in doing so had released herself from its grip. She took a new position at a different archive, one that specialized in maritime history. She found a quiet comfort in the logs of ships and the charts of tides, in stories that ended with the clean, vast silence of the sea. Years turned. The city grew and changed around the old opera house, steel and glass towers rising to dwarf its gilded dome. It was declared a historical landmark, a testament to a bygone era of grandeur. The tours continued, and the story of the Phantom was a favorite, though the details had softened and blurred into a generic tale of a lovesick ghost. The truth, as Elodie had written it, was too sharp, too sad for a quick anecdote between the grand staircase and the chandelier. It was shelved, a deeper, darker current running beneath the placid surface of popular memory. One afternoon, an elderly woman visited the Maritime Archive, where Elodie worked. She moved slowly, leaning on a cane, her back permanently bent as if under a great weight. She requested to see maps of the northern coast from a specific year. Her voice was a dry rustle, but there was a familiar cadence to it that made Elodie look up from her desk. Their eyes met across the quiet room. The woman's gaze was a faded blue, but in its depths was a recognition, a shared knowledge of a particular kind of sorrow. It was Amy. Elodie did not approach her. She simply fetched the requested materials and watched as the old woman traced a gnarled finger over a coastline. She was planning a final journey, a quiet pilgrimage to a place of cliffs and sea air. There was no music in her now, only the whisper of the wind she sought. When she left, she gave a small, almost imperceptible nod to Elodie. A silent communication between two women who understood that some stories are not meant to be told, but are simply known. Elodie never saw her again, but she read of her passing a few months later in a small, obscure obituary. It mentioned a quiet life, a love of solitude, and a private burial at sea. That night, Elodie walked home under a clear, cold sky. She stopped on the bridge overlooking the river, the lights of the city reflected on the dark water. She thought of Amy, finally free of the silver song and the memory of the pit. She thought of the phantom, his love and his poison, his music and his silence. And she thought of the mask, its blankness, now just atoms scattered in the air. She felt the story settle within her, not as a haunting, but as a part of her own history. A deep, still lake of understanding. The city around her hummed with its own life, its own stories of love and loss. But here, at the water's edge, there was only a profound and peaceful quiet, a silence that was no longer an answer, but a simple, lasting peace. The river flowed on, indifferent to the endings and beginnings it witnessed. Elodie turned from the railing and continued home. The next day at the archive, the maritime logs felt different. The names of the ships were no longer just names. They were vessels carrying lives as complex and fraught as the one she had chronicled. She worked with a new sense of purpose, not to unearth ghosts, but to honor the quiet trajectories of ordinary existence. At the Opéra de la Lune Noire, the seasons turned. A new generation of performers filled the dressing rooms, their dreams untroubled by the past. The cold spot in the orchestra pit was eventually repaired, a faulty wire in the new system blamed and replaced. The story of the groan was forgotten, replaced by newer, more immediate dramas. Yet, in the deepest cellar, the one that was never renovated, a single, persistent phenomenon remained. Patch of wall, no larger than a hand, always felt damp to the touch, no matter how dry the weather. It was not a leak, as the engineers confirmed time and again. It was cool and slightly yielding, like clay. If one pressed an ear to it, which no one ever did, they might have heard nothing at all. Or they might have heard the faintest, most distant echo of a single, sustained note from a violin. A note that had been traveling through stone and time for a century, searching for an ear that could finally hear it and let it go. But the door to that cellar was locked, and the key was lost, and the note was left to its endless, fading journey into silence. The world moved on, as it always does. The damp patch on the wall in the fifth cellar slowly hardened, crystallizing into a strange, glassy mineral that defied classification. It was a small, unremarkable secret the building kept for itself. Elodie lived a long life, her own story eventually becoming in a file in an archive. Her novel a respected, if slightly obscure, classic. She never wrote another like it, finding that some stories are singular and cannot be replicated. On her deathbed, she was calm, her mind not on ships or maps, but on the memory of a cold wooden floor and a shape that was not there. She smiled, a small, private thing, and then she was gone, her own silence merging with the one she had so meticulously documented. The Opera House, in a final, fitting act of closure, scheduled a performance of a modern, dissonant piece for the night she passed. The music was loud and chaotic, a deliberate rejection of melody. But in a quiet moment between movements, a cellist, adjusting her bow, accidentally dragged it across a string, producing a single, pure, and heartbreakingly beautiful note that hung in the air for a second before being swallowed by the next wave of sound. It was a coincidence, of course, but for that one fleeting moment, the entire building, from its gilded dome to its deepest foundation, seemed to hold its breath, listening. Then the moment passed, and the present rushed back in, leaving the past where it belonged. The city itself seemed to forget. The Opéra de la Lune Noire became a postcard, a beautiful, empty shell. The tour still pointed out the box where the phantom was said to have sat, but the guides no longer mentioned a name. He was just a story, and a vague one at that. The success of Elodie's novel had a brief renaissance, then faded again, as all things do. A copy sat on a shelf in a second-hand bookstore a few blocks away. Its spine cracked, its pages holding the weight of a truth no one sought anymore. Decades later, a young composer, struggling with a block, rented a small apartment that overlooked the opera house's rear entrance. He found the novel in that same bookstore, bought it for a few coins, and read it in a single night. He was not a superstitious man, but he was a sensitive one. The story did not haunt him with fear, but with inspiration. He began to write not an opera, but a tone poem. He called it The Negative Space. It was a piece built around silence, around the spaces between the notes, a musical representation of an outline on a floor. The piece was performed by a small experimental orchestra in a modern hall. It was not well attended, but those who were there described a strange sensation. The music was not melodious. It was atmospheric, tense, and often unbearably quiet. At its climax, there was a long rest, a void of sound so profound and carefully engineered that the audience could hear the rustle of their own clothes and the beating of their own hearts. And in that shared human silence, the composer believed he had finally given form to the echo. He had built a monument not to the phantom, nor to his music, but to the emptiness he left behind. It was the final, perfect tribute. The applause was polite, confused. The piece was never performed again. The composer moved on to other projects, but he always felt that The Negative Space was his one true, complete work. He had, in his own way, closed the circle that began with a mask in a drawer and ended with a story on a page. And now with silence in a concert hall. The story was now complete in every possible form. The manuscript for the tone poem was eventually donated to the city library, where it was cataloged and placed in a climate-controlled vault. By chance, it was filed in the same section as the stagehand's diary and Elodie's research notes, though no one made the connection. The library was a vast place, and its systems were designed for preservation, not for poetry. The silence the composer had worked so hard to create was now a literal one, the ink on the paper dormant, the rests between the notes eternal. A young intern, tasked with digitizing the library's musical holdings, scanned the pages of The Negative Space one Tuesday afternoon. She listened to a synthesized version on her computer, the digital approximation failing to capture the profound quiet of the live performance. She found it bleak and moved on to the next file, a cheerful operetta from the previous century. The story was now a set of data, a series of ones and zeros in a server farm, another layer of memory laid over the original like sediment. It was safe, and it was utterly, finally, still. The river that flowed through the city had its source in distant, forgotten hills, and it continued its journey to the sea, passing under the bridges and beside the foundations of the opera house without a pause. One summer, a dredging operation to clear debris from the riverbed turned up a sliver of white ceramic, worn smooth by a century of water and stone. A worker plucked it from the conveyor belt, finding it strangely cold, despite the summer heat. He thought it might be a piece of a doll's face, or perhaps a fragment of an old plate. For a moment, he considered pocketing it, a curious little find. But then, with a shrug, he tossed it back into the murky water. It sank without a trace, disappearing into the silt, a final physical remnant of the story returning to the element of forgetting. The circle, already closed, was now erased, its last mark washed away by the relentless, patient current. The dredging operation concluded, and the river kept its secrets. The worker who had held the ceramic fragment forgot about it by the end of his shift, his mind on more immediate concerns like his paycheck and his dinner. The piece of mask, if that is what it was, became just another part of the riverbed, a grain of cold white in the endless, shifting dark. In the city, life continued its noisy, vibrant course. The opera house announced a new season. The library servers hummed, preserving countless stories, including one about a silence. The composer of the negative space grew old, and sometimes, in his dreams, he heard not his own music, but a single, perfect note he knew he had never written. He would wake with a feeling of loss, though he could not say for what. And high in the mountains where the river began, snow fell. It fell silently, layering over the peaks, pure and blank. It was a silence that held no memory, no echo, no story. It was simply silence, waiting for the spring thaw to send new water on its long, winding journey to the city below, where it would once again pass by the old opera house, a silent witness to nothing at all and everything. Story 3. The wind did not howl. That would have been a comfort, a familiar sound of protest against the world. This wind whispered. It slid through the high, dry grasses of the prairie with a sound like pages turning in a forgotten book. A soft, sibilant rustle that carried no scent of rain or life, only the fine, alkaline dust of a land that did not want us. It was the first voice of the silence, and it spoke of a vast and patient emptiness. I remember standing by the crippled wagon, my hand on the rough, sun-bleached wood, and listening to that whisper. It seemed to coil around the words of the others, the frantic, human sounds of our despair, and swallow them whole, leaving only its own dry, relentless message. We were not welcome here. We were the hollow ones, the leftovers of a dream, the Haskins Party. They called us back in independence, a collection of hopeful faces and sturdy wagons pointed toward Oregon. That was months ago, a lifetime painted in the bright, foolish colors of promise. Now the dream was bleached, like the bones of the oxen we'd been forced to eat and then abandon. A broken axle had been the final, casual blow from an indifferent God. We tried to fix it, of course. Franco, our elected leader, a man whose broad shoulders had once seemed capable of carrying all our hopes, had labored until his hands were raw and bloody. But the wood was green and wrong, and the spare had shattered on a rock we all swore hadn't been there the day before. So we were stranded, 60 miles from Fort Laramie, a distance that might as well have been the moon. The map was a liar, its cheerful lines and optimistic notes meaningless here, where the horizon was a seamless, unbroken curve. Our little circle of wagons, once a fortress of civilization, now felt like a tiny raft on a sea of grass, and the sea was slowly draining. The days took on a terrible, ritualistic sameness. The sun would rise, a hot, white coin in a pale sky. We would ration the water, a few mouthfuls each from the barrels that were growing alarmingly light. The men would go out to scout, to hunt, to find anything, and would return with nothing but dust in their eyes and a deepening dread in their gaunt faces. The women would tend to the children, whose cries had softened into a constant weak whimpering, and I would listen to the wind. I was the scribe, the teacher, the one who was supposed to record our great adventure. My journal lay open in my lap, but the words had dried up. There was nothing to write but the slow, meticulous accounting of our dissolution. It was the children who saw it first. Little Sarah Clemens pointed one evening at the long purple shadows stretching from the west. "The tall man is back," she whispered, her voice thin as paper. Her mother shushed her, blaming the sun and hunger. But the next day, Elias Pritchard, a boy of 10, said he saw a figure walking far out on the prairie, a shape that was too thin, too still, that did not move like a man or an animal. He said it was just standing, watching us. Franco took a few men and went to look. They found nothing, not a footprint, not a broken stem of grass, only the whispering wind. Yet, the idea took root. The tall man. He became a secret we all shared, a name for the unease that had begun to curdle our community. We stopped speaking of him directly, but you could see the knowledge in the way people's eyes would dart toward the horizon at dusk, in the way conversations would falter and die. Suspicion, that old poison, began to seep in. We had food for maybe another week, if you could call the hardtack and stringy jackrabbit food. Whispers started. The Millers were hoarding bacon. The Coopers had a secret stash of water. They were just whispers, born of cracked lips and hollow stomachs, but they had weight. Then the livestock started to go. Not to predators, not in any way we could understand. One of the 2 remaining mules was found one morning, standing perfectly upright, but dead. Its eyes were gone, not pecked out, but simply absent, and its body was cold and stiff, as if it had been dead for days in the desert sun. Though the night had been mild, there were no marks on it, no blood. It was just an empty vessel. Franco ordered it butchered. No one protested. We ate the meat that night, and it was tasteless, dry, and left a feeling of cold silt in our bellies. The real horror began with the dreams. Not nightmares of monsters or chases, but something far worse. We all dreamed of the same thing, though we were afraid to admit it at first. We dreamed of a place just beyond the low rise, a place of cool green grass and a clear rushing stream. In the dream, we could smell the water, feel its cool mist on our faces. We would wake with a desperate thirst, our mouths aching for a taste of that imaginary water. It was a cruel, specific hope dangled before us, only to be snatched away by the grim reality of dawn. It felt like a taunt. It was old Mrs. Gable, the one we all thought was half mad from the start, who finally gave it a voice. She was a gaunt, leathery woman who had buried 2 husbands and outlived all her children. She sat by the fire one night, her eyes reflecting the dying embers, and she said, "It's not leading us, it's feeding us." She turned her hollow gaze on me. "It's feeding on the wanting. The more we want, the hungrier we get, and the stronger it gets. It's a farmer, and we are its crop of despair." A coldness that had nothing to do with the night air settled in my bones. She was right. I could feel it. The fear, the suspicion, the gnawing hunger. It was all a kind of sustenance. We were not just starving, we were being farmed. Tall Man was not a predator that pounced. He was a gardener, tending the soil of our souls, waiting for the harvest. The revelation broke us. The next day, Tom Cooper accused Jacob Miller of stealing his last strip of jerky. It was a stupid, petty thing. But in the heat of the afternoon, with the wind hissing its dry secrets, it became everything. Shouts turned to shoves. A knife was drawn. It was over in a moment. Jacob lay on the ground, his life bleeding out into the thirsty earth, and Tom stood over him, his face a mask of shock and horror. We buried Jacob in a shallow grave. No one said a word. The community was fractured, the last vestiges of civilization sloughed off like dead skin. That night, the dreams changed. The stream was still there, but now the tall man was standing in it. He was impossibly slender, a cutout of darkness against the dream-green grass. He had no face, only a smooth, pale expanse where features should be. And he was holding out a dipper, full of that clear, cold water. The wanting was an agony. It was a physical pain. When I woke, screaming was tearing from my throat. Others were screaming too. The camp was in chaos. In the pre-dawn gloom, I saw Sarah Clemens, little Sarah, walking steadily away from the wagons toward the western horizon. Her mother was shrieking, running after her, but Sarah did not turn. She walked with a serene sleepwalker's grace, straight toward the rise from our dreams. Her father and another man caught her, dragged her back kicking and biting, her small face contorted into a snarl. She was not herself. She was a thing of pure, distilled want. Franco gathered the few men who were still sane, still strong enough to stand. His own strength was a ghost of what it had been, but his eyes held a grim resolve. "It's her," he whispered, his voice raspy. "The Gable woman. She knows too much. She welcomed it." It was a desperate, illogical conclusion, the kind a dying mind clings to. They took her from her tent. She did not struggle. She just looked at them with those ancient, knowing eyes and smiled a tiny, secret smile. They hanged her from the limb of a dead cottonwood tree on the edge of our camp. The rope was too long and her neck didn't break. She kicked for a long, long time, her old boots scuffing the air, and the only sound was the creak of the rope and the whisper of the wind. We watched, all of us, our humanity finally, completely extinguished. We thought her death would be a sacrifice, an offering to break the spell. It was not. It was the climax. It was what it had been waiting for. As the last twitch left Mrs. Gable's body, the wind stopped. The sudden silence was more terrifying than any sound. The air grew thick and heavy, pressing down on us. And then he was there, the tall man. He stood just beyond the circle of firelight. Not as a dream, but as a physical presence. He was not a man. He was a concept given form, an embodiment of absence. His height was wrong, bending perception. His smooth, featureless face seemed to drink the faint light from the stars. He did not move toward us. He simply was, and the hunger came. Not a memory of hunger, but a new, absolute, cosmic hunger. It was a void inside us, a black hole that devoured thought, memory, hope, love. It was the essence of want, and it was infinite. I saw the others fall to their knees, clawing at their own faces, their mouths open in silent screams. I saw Franco look at his own hands as if he had never seen them before, and then he began to tear at his own arms with his teeth. The Coopers, huddled together, simply seemed to deflate, their forms losing coherence, their substance dissolving into the hungry air. I did not fight it. There was no fighting. I felt it pulling at me, drawing out everything that I was, everything I had ever been. My memories of my wife, her face, the sound of her laughter, they were pulled from me like threads from a tapestry, leaving only blankness. My own name dissolved into the void. There was no pain. There was only the serene, terrifying peace of utter unbecoming. I was a note held for a moment, and then allowed to fade into the eternal silence. The wind began to whisper again. Days, or perhaps years later, a different wagon train, pushing its own hopeful dream westward, found the place. They found the circle of wagons, bleached and skeletal. They found the graves, shallow and scattered. They found the dead mule and the pathetic scraps of a failed existence. And they found the cottonwood tree. From its lone, stark branch, an old woman's body swung gently in the dry breeze, a final, grim warning. And on the seat of the lead wagon, tucked neatly into a crack in the wood, they found my journal. It was open to a blank page. The wind, with its gentle, insistent fingers, had long since scoured all the words away. Every last one. It was just a book of empty, yellowed paper. They left it there, a meaningless relic in a silent, hungry land. I was the paper. I was the dry whisper between the grains of sand. I was the patient. alkaline dust that settled on the empty journal, on the splintered wagon seat, on the sun-bleached bones of the Haskins party. I had no name, no memory, only a vast and tranquil awareness of the emptiness I was part of. I was the land, and the land was complete. The new ones came, their sounds an offense. The creak of their wagon, the lowing of their oxen, the sharp, panicked voices of the men who found the hanging woman, and the blank book. They were so loud, so full of messy, vibrant life. I felt a tremor in the silence, a familiar, gentle pull. It was not my hunger. I was sated, whole. It was his. The tall man was here. A stillness within the greater stillness, a fold in the air that drank the sunlight. They did not stay long. Fear, sharp and bright, bloomed in their hearts. They buried the dead woman in a hurried, shallow grave, their prayers brittle little things that shattered against the immense sky. They argued over my journal, one man wanting to take it as a curiosity, another, wiser, feeling a chill and insisting they leave it be. They left it. As their wagon train pulled away, a frantic, fleeing centipede, I could feel him watching them go. There was no rush. The land was patient. The harvest is always eventual. Time became a slow turning of the earth under the stars. Seasons passed. A rain finally came, a hard, brief downpour that washed the dust from the white bones and filled the wagon canvas with a few precious inches of water that soon turned stagnant and green. A pack of wolves found the mule's skeleton and gnawed on it, their growls a brief, guttural interruption. They felt his presence too, and their feasting was nervous, hurried. They left before dawn. Then a single rider came. He was a trapper, a man so woven into the solitude of the plains that he was nearly a part of it himself. His beard was long and matted, his eyes the color of flint. He saw the circle of wagons and approached with a hunter's caution, his rifle held ready. He saw the grave, the cottonwood tree. He saw the journal. He dismounted, his movements economical and quiet. He picked up the book, his thick, calloused fingers gentle on the brittle pages. He fanned them, seeing nothing but blankness. He did not shudder. He did not make the sign of the cross. He simply stood, reading the story the silence told. He looked out across the prairie, his gaze sweeping the endless grass. He was not looking for anything human. He was looking at the land itself. He nodded, once, as if confirming a long-held suspicion. He knew. He did not have a name for it, but he knew the nature of this place. It was a thin place, a place where the world was worn through, and something else showed through the weave. He did not drop the journal. He did not throw it. He placed it back into the crack in the wagon seat, with the same care one might place a stone on a cairn. It was a gesture of understanding, a warning for the next ones, or perhaps an offering. He remounted his horse and turned its head away from the setting sun, back the way he had come. He was leaving the territory. He was the only one who ever did. I felt a flicker then, not of hunger, but of something else. A recognition. The trapper was not food. He was a part of the ecosystem, a stone that the stream of hunger could not wear down. His passing was noted, and then forgotten. The years stretched. The wagon wood sagged, then collapsed. The journal's pages were torn by the wind and scattered, the words that were no longer there becoming one with the dust. The bones of the Haskins party were bleached whiter than white, and then, grain by grain, they were buried by the patient soil. The cottonwood tree, long dead, finally shed its limb with the creak of a dying giant. The rope fell, the fibers rotting away to nothing. Now, there is only the prairie. The grass grows tall and then brown, a sea of whispers under a vast empty sky. There is no marker, no memory, no story. There is only the land and the wind, and the quiet, patient presence that waits within it. The hunger is dormant, but it is not gone. It is the land, and the land is forever. It waits for the next dreamers, the next hopeful, hungry hearts. It waits for the seed to be planted, so the harvest may begin again. The silence is different now. It is no longer a held breath, but a deep, settled exhalation. I am the dust motes dancing in a sunbeam that has not witnessed a human eye in decades. I am the root of the hardy grass that pushes up through the splintered ribs of a wagon. I am the patient erosion of a single forgotten button buried in the dirt. The great hunger is a slumbering beast beneath the hills. Its dreams the gentle shifting of the continental plates. A new sound begins, not of creaking wood or lowing oxen, but a low rhythmic thrumming that vibrates through the earth. It is a sound the land has not known. It grows from a tremor to a roar, and then a metal thing on wheels, gleaming under the sun, rips a path through the grass where no trail remains. It stops near the remnants of the cottonwood, its engine ticking as it cools. A man and a woman climb out. They wear clothes of synthetic fabric, bright and alien. They carry devices that click and whir. They speak of geology, of soil samples, of the lay of the land for a new road. Their words are technical, empty of ghosts. The man kicks at a piece of rusted metal, once a stove. The woman looks through her device, a flat, dark slate that holds maps of stars she cannot see in the daytime sky. They are full of a different kind of want, a sharp, acquisitive hunger for progress, for data, for the future. It's a vibrant, potent strain. The slumbering thing stirs. It does not rise, but it turns in its sleep. A wave of profound, ancient ennui radiates from the soil. The woman shivers suddenly, though the day is warm. She looks up from her slate, her professional composure cracking for an instant. She scans the horizon, not for mineral deposits, but with a primal, nervous flicker of her eyes. "It's strange," she says, her voice quieter now. "I feel, I don't know, like we're being sized up." The man laughs, a short, dismissive sound. "It's just the emptiness, gets to people." He is already turning back to his work, his mind on grades and elevations. But the woman does not look away. She is listening, though she does not know what for. She is hearing the oldest whisper, the one beneath the wind. It is not speaking of water or of hope. It is speaking of the quiet that will follow the roar, the grass that will reclaim the road, the dust that will consume the gleaming metal. It is a whisper of a timescale that dwarfs her ambitions. They leave before sunset, their report filed, their data collected. They will recommend the route. The road will be built. For a time the thrumming will return, louder and more constant. But the hunger has tasted them, and it has found their particular wanting, their certainty, their noise, their fleeting power. To be a fascinating vintage. It can wait. It has learned the shape of their dreams, and it knows they too will pass. The prairie holds its silence, a cup waiting to be filled. The surveyor's report was approved. The great machines came, their diesel breath fouling the air, their steel blades cutting a raw, brown wound across the prairie. Men in hard hats shouted over the noise, their lives a frantic blur of schedules and paychecks. They paved over the graves of the Haskins party without ever knowing they were there. They cut down the stump of the cottonwood tree and hauled it away. For a season, there was only the shriek of progress. Then the road opened. It was a 2-lane black ribbon, a concession to the vastness, not a victory over it. Cars whispered by, their occupants sealed in climate-controlled bubbles, their eyes glued to screens, their minds on destinations. They did not see the prairie. They saw scenery, a monotony to be endured. Their wants were small, immediate, and digital. A stronger signal, a faster car, a better playlist. It was fast food for the spirit, and the ancient hunger patient as a glacier, found it unfulfilling. It did not stir from its slumber. It simply watched this new, frantic ecosystem with a detached, cosmic indifference. The road brought others. A man whose car broke down just as the sun was dipping below the horizon. He stood by the side of the road, phone held high, his face a mask of frustration as he searched for a bar of service that would not come. The silence began to press in on him. The wind, which had been a background noise, became a voice. He felt a profound, unsettling loneliness. He began to walk, not toward any known point, but simply to move. He remembered a story his grandfather told him about a stream that was so cold it hurt your teeth. The wanting was a dull, familiar ache. He was found the next day, 10 miles down the road, dehydrated and babbling about a tall man who offered him a dipper of air. They took him to a hospital, and he was later diagnosed with heat stroke. A family on a road trip, seeking a real America, pulled over for a picnic at a designated rest stop that now occupied the eastern edge of where the wagon circle had been. The children, bored with the landscape, chased each other through the tall grass behind the concrete tables. The little girl, her laughter echoing, suddenly stopped. She pointed at a gnarled piece of wood half buried in the soil, the last unrecognizable fragment of a wagon. "The quiet man is sad," she said. Her parents laughed, a nervous, dismissive sound, and hurried her back to the car. That night in a motel 50 miles away, the girl woke up screaming, dreaming of a cool green place just beyond a hill she had never seen. These small, quiet moments were the new harvest. Not the soul-rending feasts of old, but scattered, forgotten snacks. The hunger absorbed the frustration of the stranded motorist, the fleeting unease of the tourists, the subconscious dread of the parents. It was enough. The land had adapted. I am the crack in the asphalt, where the first brave blade of grass has emerged. I am the faded plastic bag caught on a barbed wire fence, rustling a synthetic prayer. I am the reflection of a passing semi-truck in a stagnant puddle that once, long ago, was a grave. The tall man is still here. You can see him if you know how to look, not as a figure, but as a trick of the light, a shimmer in the heat haze over the blacktop. He is the reason you suddenly feel the need to check your locks when driving this stretch at night. He is the source of that unaccountable sadness that sometimes washes over you for no reason. He is in the silence between songs on the radio. He is waiting for the world to grow quiet again, for the great, desperate wants to return. And he knows, with the infinite patience of the earth itself, that they will. The world never truly grows quiet. Not anymore. The low, constant hum is the new silence, a baseline of wanting that never ceases. It is a different kind of sustenance, a steady drip feed of modern anxieties and digital loneliness. The hunger consumes the quiet desperation of the long-haul trucker. Amphetamines keeping him awake through the night. His mind fixed on a home he only ever sees in pictures on his phone. It feeds on the fleeting regret of the businessman who speeds past at 90 miles an hour, suddenly wondering if the promotion was worth the divorce. These are not the grand, soul-shattering hungers of pioneers, but they are endless, and they are enough. I am the glitch in the GPS that tells a driver to turn onto a non-existent dirt road. I am the sudden, inexplicable cell phone dead zone that lasts for exactly 1 mile. I am the fatigue that makes a traveler's eyes heavy, convincing them to pull over and rest for just a moment at that lonely rest stop, where the shadows are just a little too long. A new family stops there now. A minivan with out-of-state plates. The father is checking a map on his tablet, frustrated by the lag. The mother is trying to calm a crying baby. An older child, a boy of about 10, wanders away from the picnic table, kicking at the gravel. He stops at the historical marker, a small, sun-faded plaque erected by the local historical society. It says something bland and inaccurate about the perseverance of pioneers on the long trail west. The boy's eyes skip over the words, but he feels something. A chill, despite the heat. He looks up from the plaque and across the road into the endless rolling grass. He sees it. Not a man, but a suggestion of one. A distortion in the air, a vertical stillness that the wind does not touch. It is tall, impossibly so, and it seems to pull the very light into itself. The boy does not scream. He is not afraid. He feels a profound, aching curiosity. He takes a step forward, off the curb, his small shoes scuffing the asphalt. In that moment, the hunger shifts. It has been nursing on the thin gruel of modern discontent. But here is something purer. A child's wonder is a delicate thing, but a child's want is an absolute. The boy wants to know what it is. He wants to see. He takes another step. A horn blares. A truck rumbles past, its wind buffeting the boy, breaking the spell. His mother shrieks, grabs his arm, yanks him back to safety. She scolds him, her voice shrill with fear for not looking. The moment is buried under a landslide of parental anxiety and relief. The family packs up quickly and drives away. The boy stares out the back window, his face pressed against the glass. He does not see the tall man again, but he will never forget the feeling. That deep, cool pull, that whisper of a secret, just beyond the edge of the world. He will carry that small, empty space inside him for the rest of his life. And the hunger will carry it too. A seed planted in fertile soil. Waiting. The boy grew into a quiet man. He became a historian, specializing in the trails and tragedies of the westward expansion. His colleagues praised his meticulous research, but they sometimes wondered about his obsession with a single, unremarkable stretch of prairie, a place now bisected by a state highway. He never married. He rarely socialized. He was a man haunted not by a ghost, but by a feeling, a hollow space that all his books and maps could never fill. Every few years he would make the drive. He would stand at that rest stop, watching the cars blur past, and feel the old, cool pull from across the asphalt. He was the only one who ever came back. The hunger knew him. It did not stir for him, for his was a refined intellectual want, a desire to understand that was in its own way a form of communion. It was satisfied with this long, slow relationship. He was a testament to its endurance. One evening, as the historian stood there, a storm gathered on the horizon. It was not a normal storm. The clouds were a sickly green, and the air grew still and heavy, the way it does before a tornado. The traffic thinned, then stopped. Drivers, heeding warnings on their phones, sought shelter in the nearest town miles away. For the first time in decades, the land fell into a true and profound silence, broken only by the distant rumble of thunder. The historian did not leave. He stood by his car, watching the sky churn. He felt the familiar presence intensify, no longer a shimmer in the heat, but a solidifying darkness under the cottonwoods that had grown up along a nearby creek. The tall man was stepping forward into a world grown momentarily quiet enough to hold him, and the historian felt his lifelong curiosity finally curdle into fear. This was not an academic question anymore. It was a physical reality. The want to know was replaced by a more primal want, the want to live. He fumbled for his car door, his keys slipping in his sweaty hand. The wind hit then, not a gust, but a wall. It tore the door from his hand and sent it slamming into the side of the car. The rain followed, not in drops, but in a horizontal sheet of water that felt like needles. In the chaos, he saw him clearly, for the first time. There were no features, only a column of absolute night, a hole in the fabric of the storm. It was turning toward him. The historian did the only thing he could think of. He did not run. He did not pray. He reached into his car, grabbed his latest research, a folder full of photocopied journal entries and land grant maps, and he threw it. The papers exploded into a white cloud, instantly soaked and shredded by the wind, whipping toward the dark figure. The tall man paused. The swirling papers, these fragile, meaningless records of a story he had already consumed, seemed to amuse him. The hunger recognized the gesture for what it was, not a challenge, but an offering, a sacrifice of the very knowledge the man had spent his life seeking. The storm abated as quickly as it had begun. The rain softened to a drizzle. The historian, soaked and trembling, slumped against his car. The presence was gone. The only sound was the drip of water from the trees and the faint, returning moan of a distant semi-truck downshifting on the highway. He drove away and never returned. He died years later in a small apartment, surrounded by his books. His own unpublished manuscript on the Haskins party was found on his desk. The final page was blank. The land had taken his story too. Not with violence, but with a slow, patient acceptance. The hunger had added a new, subtle flavor to its memory. The taste of a man who spent his life trying to name the unnameable, and who, in the end, offered his work to the silence. It was a satisfying vintage. The prairie settled back into its new rhythm, the whisper of tires on wet pavement, a lullaby for the ancient thing that slept beneath, forever dreaming of the next dreamer. The whisper of tires became a constant song. The road was resurfaced, widened in places. The rest stop was updated with brighter lights and a digital sign displaying weather alerts and amber alerts. The world became louder, brighter, more connected in its own frantic way. Yet, the hollow space the historian had carried seemed to bleed into the very location. People started talking about the stretch of road online. They called it a dead zone for more than just cell service. They reported a sudden, overwhelming sense of melancholy, a feeling of being watched by something old and indifferent. Some claimed their radios would scan through stations, only to land on a frequency of pure, whispering static that sounded like wind through long grass. The hunger observed this new development. It had not sought this attention, but it would use it. The modern want for mystery, for a brush with the supernatural, was a potent, if ironic, crop. The tall man became a cryptid, a ghost story told on podcasts and Reddit threads. Teenagers would dare each other to drive the road at night, turning off their headlights for one terrifying mile. Most saw nothing. A few saw the shimmer, the trick of the light, and their thrilled fear was a fleeting, sugary treat. Then came the documentarian, a young woman with a fierce intelligence and a sensitive microphone, determined to debunk the myth. She arrived with a small crew, all of them skeptical, armed with EMF meters and infrared cameras. They interviewed the historian's aging colleagues. They read his unpublished manuscript. They set up their equipment at the rest stop as the sun went down. The night was clear and cold. The stars were a brilliant, icy dusting overhead. The documentarian stood where the historian had stood, speaking to her camera about mass psychology and the power of suggestion. But as she spoke, her words began to feel small and foolish. The silence here was not an absence of sound, but a presence. The microphone picked up nothing, but her own ears seemed to strain against a pressure. A low frequency, just below hearing. She dismissed her crew back to their van to review footage, insisting on staying alone for a final piece to camera. The moment the van door closed, the feeling intensified. It was not fear, but a profound and heavy sadness, the weight of centuries of forgotten hopes. She looked out at the prairie, and the starlight seemed to coalesce, not into a man, but into a deeper darkness, a silhouette of endless depth. Her skepticism, her modern armor, crumbled. She wasn't seeing a ghost. She was perceiving a condition of the land itself, a permanent and hungry silence. The tall man was not a being, but a property, like gravity, and it was aware of her. She did not run. She lifted her microphone, not toward the darkness, but toward the empty air, and she whispered a single question into the night. "What are you waiting for?" The answer did not come in words. It came as a direct injection of knowing into her mind. It showed her the slow, inevitable death of the sun, the cooling of the planet, the return of the ice, the final quiet extinction of all noise, all want, all life. It was waiting for the universe itself to grow still. Her own brief life, her career, her documentary, were less than a single frame in a film that would run for eons. The crew found her 10 minutes later, sitting on the ground, the microphone still in her hand, her face wet with tears she could not explain. The documentary was never finished. The footage was archived, the sound files a confusing jumble of clean audio and unexplained, mournful sighs that the microphones had captured, but no one had heard at the time. She left her profession and moved to a small, quiet town where she took up gardening. She found a deep, quiet comfort in the turn of the seasons, the patient growth of plants from seed. She never spoke of what she learned that night, because she had no words for it. She had felt the scale of the hunger, and in doing so, had her own small human wants scoured away. She had been given not a story, but an understanding. And in that she had provided the oldest presence of all with a rare and satisfying meal, not of fear or desire, but of pure, unadulterated recognition. The land had been seen, and for a moment it was enough. The seasons turned at their own pace, indifferent to the small dramas that flickered and died along the black ribbon of the road. The documentarian's garden grew wild and lush, a tangle of life that required little tending. She was content in a way that felt borrowed, as if the silence she had encountered had left a permanent, peaceful void inside her. She was the only one who had asked the right question, and in return had been given an answer that ended all questions. She was no longer interesting to the hunger. She was complete. The road, however, continued to produce its small, sad harvest. A new generation of seekers arrived, armed with more sophisticated technology, drawn by the layers of legend that now clung to the place. The pioneer tragedy, the vanished historian, the silenced documentarian. They set up laser grids and full-spectrum cameras, their voices loud with excitement and bravado. They hoped to capture a shadow, a voice, a chill. The tall man gave them nothing. He was not a performer. The hunger merely absorbed their fervent, desperate desire to believe, to be the one who finally proved it. Their disappointment as they packed up their empty equipment was palpable, a bitter herb that the land consumed with a faint sense of distaste. It was also repetitive, so shallow. The real change happened slowly, over years. Traffic patterns shifted. A new interstate was built 30 miles to the south, a wider, faster river of concrete that siphoned away the steady flow of travelers. The state highway was used less and less. The asphalt began to crack in earnest, and this time no great machines came to repair it. Weeds and hardy prairie grass reclaimed the edges, their roots patiently undermining the pavement from below. The digital sign at the rest stop flickered out one night and never lit again. The lights followed, their bulbs stolen or shattered, leaving the concrete tables and the weathered plaque to the moon and the stars. The world, in its own small way, was growing quiet again. One autumn evening, a man walked down the center line of the abandoned road. He was not a seeker. He was a survivor. The society that had built the road had, in many places, crumbled. There had been collapses, shortages, a great unraveling. He carried a pack and a knife, and his wants were elemental. Water, shelter, safety. He was tired, his body aching with a deep cellular fatigue. He saw the old rest stop and decided it was as good a place as any to spend the night. He built a small, careful fire using splinters from a shattered picnic table, its heat a welcome comfort against the creeping chill. He ate the last of his dried meat, and the want for more food was a sharp physical pain in his gut. The wind moved through the long grass, a sound he had almost forgotten. It was the sound of the world before people. He felt a profound and terrifying loneliness, a sense of his own smallness in the face of the vast, dark prairie. He looked up from his fire. There, at the edge of the circle of light, stood the tall man. He was not a shimmer or a suggestion. He was there. His form was woven from shadow and starlight, and the memory of cold streams. He was more real than the man, than the fire, than the road itself. The man did not scream. He was beyond that. He simply stared, his modern mind stripped of its technological buffers, recognizing something ancient and true. The tall man extended a hand that was more of an idea than a shape. In it was a dipper, carved from a gourd that had not grown in a century. It was full of clear, cold water. The man's thirst was a roaring in his ears. It was the only thing in the world. He knew on some level deeper than instinct what the offering meant. It was a trade. His want, his beautiful, terrible, life-ending want for a single moment of satisfaction. With a hand that trembled not from fear but from need, he reached out and took it. Story 4-2. The chill began in the nursery, a pocket of winter in the perpetual climate-controlled spring of the house. It was not a draft from the window, which was sealed tight against the October night, nor a malfunction of the vent overhead. It was a localized phenomenon, a sphere of absolute cold that hung in the space directly above the crib where Kingston slept. Alec felt it the first time when he went in for the 2 a.m. feeding. A sudden plunge in temperature that raised the fine hairs on his forearms and made his breath catch in his throat. He stood there for a long moment, his son a warm, breathing bundle in his arms, and stared into that invisible, frigid spot in the air, a hole punched through the warmth of the world. He mentioned it to Audrey the next morning as she scrolled through her phone, her coffee steaming untouched on the granite countertop. She offered a distracted smile, a ghost of the woman who had painted the nursery walls a soft, celestial blue. Her hands steady and sure. Old houses settle, Alec. It's probably just the pipes in the wall. But the house wasn't old. They had chosen it for its newness, its lack of history, its blank slate perfection. It was a house without ghosts, or so they had believed. The chill persisted. It became a third presence in the nursery, a silent observer to the late-night rituals of fatherhood. Alec, a man who had built his life like a carefully engineered structure, found his attention fracturing. He would be watching Kingston, tracing the perfect map of veins visible through the delicate skin of his son's temples, and his gaze would be drawn upward to that spot of nothing, that sensory void. He started taking its temperature with a meat thermometer from the kitchen, its digital display blinking absurdly. 52, 48, once a heart-stopping 41 degrees Fahrenheit. He did not tell Audrey about the thermometer. The shared space between them, once so vast and open, was beginning to feel partitioned, like rooms being quietly boarded up from the inside. Then came the silence. It was not an absence of sound, but a swallowing of it. On the third night of the chill, Alec was rocking Kingston. The only sounds the creak of the glider and the soft, wet sounds of the baby nursing. Then abruptly, the creak vanished. The sound simply ceased to exist the moment it entered that cold sphere. He could feel the vibration of the chair and the floorboards, see the motion, but the accompanying noise was erased, absorbed into that chilling quiet. He clutched Kingston tighter, a primal fear, cold and slick, coiling in his gut. This was not settling. This was an intrusion. The end, when it came, was not heralded by a scream or a crash, but by a profound and terrible stillness. It was a Tuesday. Audrey had taken Kingston for his 4-month checkup. Alec had come home early, wanting to surprise her, to break the strange tension that had grown like a fungus between them. He found the house empty, the silence within it different from the one in the nursery. This was a hollow, abandoned silence. A note was on the counter, written in Audrey's looping script on the back of a grocery receipt. It did not say she was sorry. It did not say she loved him. It said only, "I can do this. He's safe. Don't look for us." The police were polite, efficient. A missing persons report was filed. There was no evidence of foul play. Audrey's car was gone, her suitcase, a selection of her clothes. Her bank account had been emptied days before. The narrative they constructed was one of a young mother overwhelmed, succumbing to a silent, private terror. They spoke of postpartum depression in hushed, knowing tones. Alec listened, nodding, the perfect picture of a concerned, betrayed husband. But he knew it was a lie. Because when he had walked into the nursery after finding the note, the cold spot was gone. In its place was a warmth, a feverish, biological heat that clung to the air, thick and sweet with the scent of spoiled milk, and something else, something metallic, like old blood. His perfect life was not broken. It had been a facade, and something had peeled it back. The search he embarked upon was not the one the police conducted. He did not call friends or family. He did not plaster the city with pictures of his son's face. He began to walk. He left the new house in its tidy neighborhood, and he walked into the city's forgotten places, the seams and stitches that held the bright daytime world together. He walked along train tracks that gleamed like black snakes under a gibbous moon. He paced the edges of industrial parks where the air tasted of rust and chemicals. He lingered in the concrete channels of flood control rivers, places designed for runoff, for the things a city needs to purge. He was looking for a crack, a door, a whisper. He was looking for the logic that governed the chill and the heat, the silence and the loss. He slept in his car, his dreams filled with images of Audrey, not as a runaway wife, but as a priestess performing a ritual in a room that pulsed with a dark, internal light. Days bled into weeks. The city in its hidden corners began to speak to him. He found a community garden, overgrown and neglected, where the sunflowers had grown to monstrous heights, their heads heavy, their centers not seeds, but a crawling black infestation of beetles that clicked in unison. An old woman, her skin like wrinkled parchment, was pulling nightshade from the soil. She did not look at him as he approached, but she spoke, her voice the sound of dry leaves skittering on pavement. "They take the firstborn sometimes," she said, her gnarled fingers digging in the dirt. "Not for malice, for balance. The city is a hungry child. It must be fed." Alex stood, frozen, as she held up a clump of dark earth. Woven through the roots were fine, white hairs, like the downy hair of a newborn. Another night, under a bridge where the graffiti seemed to shift and writhe in the periphery of his vision, he met a man huddled over a fire in a steel drum. The man's face was a road map of scars and hard living, but his eyes were preternaturally clear. He offered Alec a swig from a bottle of something clear and potent. "You smell of it," the man rasped. "The hollow women. They walk among us, full of light and life, until the debt is called. They build a nest of love and warmth, a perfect little nest, and then they come to collect the interest." He poked the fire with a stick, sending up a shower of sparks. "The child is the anchor. The child is the key. They use the love, you see. They use it to open the door." Alec's world, once governed by spreadsheets and 5-year plans, had been dismantled. Folklore was not metaphor here, in the Shadowlands. It was the operating system of reality. He understood now that Audrey had not been his wife, not truly. She had been a vessel, a placeholder, a beautiful breathing landmark in a transaction he had never agreed to. Their love, their home, Kingston himself, it had all been part of an architecture he could not see, designed for a purpose he was only now beginning to fathom. The revelation came on a night when the rain fell not in drops, but in a fine, misting spray that coated everything in a cold sweat. He was drawn to the old city reservoir, a vast decommissioned basin surrounded by a high fence. The gate was open, the lock rusted through. He walked through, the wet gravel crunching under his feet. In the center of the vast, empty concrete bowl, a figure stood. It was Audrey. She was facing away from him, her hair plastered to her skull by the rain. She was holding a bundle, not the soft, blue, swaddled bundle of Kingston, but something darker, smaller. The air around her shimmered, not with heat, but with a profound and absolute cold, the same cold from the nursery, now grown to encompass the entire reservoir basin. The sound of the rain ceased. The world was mute. He called her name. The word had no sound, but she turned. Her face was a mask of serene, terrible knowledge. There was no love in her eyes, no remorse, only a deep, cosmic weariness. She was not the mother of his child. She was a custodian, a gatekeeper. In her arms, the bundle shifted. It was not a child. It was a shape of woven shadows and faint, phosphorescent light, a thing of pulsating alien geometry that hurt his eyes to look upon. It had 100 tiny, grasping limbs that were not limbs, and a single lidless eye that held the chill of dead stars. This was Kingston. This was what his son had always been, what he had been nurtured to become. The perfect life was the cocoon. The love was the nutrient. The chill was the presence of the thing growing inside the fragile human shell. She did not speak, but understanding flooded into him, poured into the silent spaces of his mind. There were pacts older than cities, balances that needed to be maintained. Certain bloodlines carried the duty, the honor, of anchoring these ancient slumbering things to the world, of giving them a temporary home in the flesh of a newborn, a vessel of pure, uncomplicated love. When the time was right, the human shell was shed, and the thing within, the true child, was welcomed back. Audrey's betrayal was the highest form of devotion. She had not stolen his son. She had returned a god to its cradle. Alec fell to his knees on the cold, wet concrete. The fight went out of him not in a rush, but in a slow, final exhalation. What was there to fight? What was there to reclaim? The father in him was dead, because the child he had fathered had never existed. He had been a tenant in a house, built for another purpose, a gardener tending a plant that was, in truth, the seed of a forest god. The silence broke. The rain sound returned, a soft hiss. The shimmering cold around Audrey and the thing in her arms began to contract, to fold in on itself. The light bent, the shadows deepened, and then, with a soft, final sigh of displaced air, they were gone. The reservoir was just a reservoir again, vast, empty, and dark. Alec did not get up. He did not weep. He remained on his knees as the dawn began to bleach the sky, a pale, sickly gray. The rain stopped. The world was washed clean, but he was stained with a knowledge that would never fade. Weeks later, he was back in the new house. It was empty, the furniture shrouded in white sheets, the for sale sign staked into the perfect lawn. He had come for one last thing. He stood in the doorway of the nursery. The room was bare, the blue walls already repainted a neutral, buyer-friendly beige. The crib was gone. The glider was gone. There was no trace of the child who had never been. But in the exact center of the room, on the pristine, beige wall at the height where a crib rail would have been, there was a single, perfect handprint. It was small, the size of an infant's hand, but it was not made of paint or dirt. It was a faint, shimmering tracery of frost, delicate as a fossilized fern. It did not melt. As he watched, a tiny, intricate pattern of ice crystals bloomed from one of the fingertip marks, spreading across the wall like a silver, unknowable script. Alec, the devoted father, did not move. He did not try to touch it or understand it. He simply stood in the doorway, his hands hanging limp at his sides, and observed this final, inexplicable detail. It was a signature. It was a farewell. It was a reminder that the world was infinitely stranger and more terrible than he had ever dreamed, and that some doors, once opened, can never be fully closed. He accepted it. The silence in the house was no longer hollow. It was full. It was waiting, and he would wait with it. He did not sell the house. The realtor's calls went unanswered. The letters piled up unopened inside the door. He moved back in, not into the master bedroom, but into a small, spare room at the back of the house that had been intended for a home office. He brought a cot, a single lamp, and a change of clothes. The rest of the space he left as it was, a museum of a life that had been a carefully constructed lie. His days took on a new and rigid shape. He would rise at dawn and stand in the doorway of the nursery, observing the frost print. It changed daily. Some mornings it was a simple, stark outline. Others, it had blossomed into complex, dendritic patterns that crept toward the ceiling, mapping constellations he did not recognize. It never melted, even when the summer heat pressed against the windows. The room itself maintained a constant cool temperature, a sacred grove preserved in the heart of the suburban home. He began to read, not the engineering journals that had once filled his briefcase, but other texts. He sought out forgotten mythologies, accounts of changelings and fetch beasts, of household gods and familiars. He found a worn copy of the Malleus Maleficarum in a second-hand shop and studied its cold logic. He read about the green children of Woolpit and the fairy mounds of Ireland. He was no longer a grieving father seeking answers. He was a scholar, an acolyte, studying the doctrine of a religion that had claimed his life. He quit his job. The money from Audrey's emptied account was gone, but he had his own savings, a substantial sum he had meticulously saved for Kingston's college fund. He used it to live. The money felt tainted, part of the same transaction, and spending it was a form of penance. He ate simple food. He rarely spoke. The man who had built a life on plans and projections was now living in a state of perpetual, watchful surrender. One evening, as autumn began to turn the leaves outside, he was in the nursery doorway. The frost had formed a perfect, intricate snowflake, the size of a dinner plate. Its geometry so complex, it seemed to draw the light from the room into its crystalline heart. As he watched, a sliver of the pattern detached itself from the wall. It did not fall. It floated, a shard of frozen light, and drifted across the room toward him. It hovered for a moment before his face, and he felt no cold from it, only a profound and ancient stillness. Then it dissolved into a mist that vanished before it touched the floor. This was a communication, an invitation. He began to prepare. He did not know for what, but he knew he must be ready. He cleaned the house, not to erase the past, but to honor the space. He polished the empty floors, washed the windows that looked out onto a world that now seemed like a flimsy backdrop. He felt the house changing around him. The silence was no longer passive. It was attentive. Sometimes, in the deep of night, he would hear a sound like the faint, high chime of breaking glass, a sound that seemed to come from the very walls. On the night of the winter solstice, he knew it was time. He stood in the nursery. The frost had covered the entire wall, a breathtaking tapestry of ice and shadow that pulsed with a soft internal luminescence. The air hummed with a power that was neither good nor evil, but simply vast. He did not feel fear. He felt a quiet culmination. The center of the frosted wall began to darken, not into blackness, but into a deep, ultramarine blue, the exact shade of the celestial paint Audrey had once brushed onto these walls. The blue swirled, forming a vortex. Within it, he saw things. A forest of towering, black trees under a sky with too many moons. A city of impossible, spiraling architecture that hurt his mind to see. And for a fleeting second, he saw Audrey. She was standing on a wind-swept plain of black sand, her face turned toward a bruised and alien sky. She was not a prisoner. She was a sentinel. She looked back at him, and in her eyes, he saw not an apology, but a recognition, acknowledgement of his witness. Then the vision was gone. The wall of frost shattered, but it did not shatter into pieces. It shattered into a million motes of silver light, each one a tiny, frozen star. They filled the room, swirling around him in a silent, beautiful storm. They did not touch him, but he felt their presence. A billion tiny intelligences acknowledging his existence. As the whirlwind of light began to fade, one last thing happened. On the floor, in the very center of the room, a small object coalesced from the fading light. It was a single, perfect rattle, carved from a wood so dark it seemed to drink the light, and inlaid with those same shimmering lines of frost. It was not a toy. It was a relic. Alec knelt and picked it up. It was warm to the touch. He held it in his palm. This artifact from a world that was not his own, a gift or a token from the thing that had worn his son's face. He understood then that his role had shifted once more. He was no longer the father, nor just the scholar. He was the keeper, the guardian of the threshold. The house was not just a house. It was an outpost, a listening post on the border of the impossible. He placed the rattle on the empty windowsill of the nursery. Then he turned and walked out, closing the door softly behind him. He went to the kitchen and put the kettle on. The ordinary sound of its whistle was a strange and distant thing. He had his tea in the silent living room, watching the moon rise over the rooftops of the normal sleeping world. He was alone, but he was not lonely. The silence in the house was alive. It was his congregation, and he would wait, for as long as it took, for the next sign. The days that followed were not empty. They were filled with a new kind of work. He started a journal, not of his feelings, but of his observations. He recorded the minute changes in the nursery's temperature, the subtle shifts in the pattern of frost on the rattle, the specific quality of the silence on different days. It was a logbook for a silent ship sailing uncharted waters. He found that his old desire for control had been refined into a disciplined practice of attention. He began to take walks again, but these were different. He was not searching for cracks in the world anymore. He was observing them. He saw how the morning frost on a neighbor's roof sometimes formed the same dendritic pattern he'd seen on the nursery wall. He noticed how certain stray cats would stop and stare not at him, but at his house, their eyes reflecting a knowledge he now shared. The city was not just a place where these things happened. It was woven through with them, and his house was a knot in that fabric. One afternoon, a woman came to the door. She was young, with tired eyes and a nervous posture, holding a flyer. "I'm sorry to bother you," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "My cat, he's been missing for 3 days. His name is Jasper. Have you seen him?" She held out the flyer with a picture of a handsome ginger Tom. Alec almost gave his standard, polite refusal. But then he looked past her, into her eyes, and saw it. A flicker of the same hollow, knowing fear that had once lived in Audrey's gaze. It was not the fear of a lost pet. It was the fear of a broken pact, a disrupted balance. "He liked to sit on the back fence, didn't he?" Alec said, the words coming to him without conscious thought. In the spot where the shadow from the oak tree falls, even at noon, the woman's face went pale. How did you know that?" Alec didn't answer. He simply looked at her, and in that look, an understanding passed between them. She was not just a neighbor. She was part of it. Another gardener tending a different, strange plant. "He hasn't gone far," Alec said, his voice low and even. "Check the old storm drain at the end of the street. Don't call his name. Just wait. He will come out when he is ready." The woman stared at him for a long moment, her fear now mixed with a dawning, terrible relief. She nodded once, a sharp, jerky motion, then turned and hurried away without another word. Alec closed the door. He leaned against it, his heart pounding not with anxiety, but with a strange, grim certainty. He had a role now. The silence in the house had not just been waiting for him. It had been preparing him. He was becoming a resource, a guide for those who stumbled in the dark corners of the world he now called home. That night, he checked the nursery. The dark rattle on the sill seemed to pulse softly, and the air in the room tasted clean and sharp, like the air after a lightning strike. He knew with a certainty that went deeper than bone that the ginger tomcat was back home, curled on its owner's bed, and that it was no longer just a cat. It was something more, and something less. And he, Alec, had helped usher it through its change. He went to his cot and slept a dreamless, perfect sleep. The waiting was over. The work had begun. The next morning, the doorbell rang. It was not the tentative chime of a lost pet owner, but a firm, sustained press. Through the peephole, Alec saw a man in a dark, impeccably tailored coat, his face sharp and unreadable. He did not look like a neighbor. He carried a briefcase of worn, supple leather that seemed to absorb the morning light. Alec opened the door. The man's eyes, a flat, gunmetal gray, swept over him, then past him into the dim hall, as if taking inventory of the silence. "Alec," the man said. It was not a question. His voice was dry, precise, like pages turning in an old book. "My name is Alistair. I understand you've recently come into a position of some responsibility." Alec said nothing. He simply stood as a barrier, feeling the weight of the house behind him, the presence of the rattle in the nursery. Alistair's lips twitched in what might have been a smile. "May I come in? It's about the upkeep. The old agreements require a certain maintenance, and it seems you've been performing it admirably, if informally." He stepped across the threshold without waiting for an answer. As he did, the air in the hallway chilled. The man did not seem to notice. He walked slowly toward the living room, his shoes making no sound on the polished floor. "The previous custodian was your wife," Alistair continued, setting his briefcase on the shrouded sofa. "Audrey's line has held this post for generations. Her role was to prepare the vessel, to nurture the anchor, until it was strong enough to be reclaimed. Your role, as the proximate source of the emotional substrate, was to provide the initial spark. A genetic key, if you will." He clicked the briefcase open. Inside were not papers, but an array of vials filled with what looked like liquid smoke, and several instruments of polished brass and dark wood that Alec could not name. "The transaction is complete," Alec said, his voice rough from disuse. "Oh, the primary transaction, yes," Alistair agreed, selecting a long, needle-like tool. "The anchor has been returned, but the gate remains. A door, once opened, must be tended. It requires a warden. Audrey's task was the offering. Yours is the vigil. Yours is the vigil." He turned to face Alec fully, the brass instrument held lightly in his hand. "There are rules, protocols. The energies you are dealing with are not passive. They are conscious, and they are hungry. Your intervention with the feline yesterday was unorthodox. You acted on instinct. Instinct is not enough. Without the proper knowledge, you are a child playing with a live wire. You could attract things that should not be called. Alistair gestured with a tool toward the nursery. "That artifact you keep is not a souvenir. It is a focus, a seal. It must be calibrated. The patterns you observe are not random, Frost. They are our language. A status report. You need to learn to read it." He approached Alec, his movements fluid and unnervingly quiet. "I am here to provide you with the necessary education. Consider me a consultant from the firm that manages these assets." Alec looked from the man's cold eyes to the strange instruments in the briefcase. He thought of the swirling motes of light, the vision of Audrey on the alien plane, the profound and terrible truth that had settled in his bones. This was not an offer. It was an induction. He gave a single, slow nod. "Good," Alistair said. He did not smile. "Then we shall begin. The first lesson is on resonance and the dangers of sympathetic vibration. The love you felt for the vessel was not wasted. It is the very frequency that keeps the door stable, but grief, unchecked, can warp it. Your grief is now a tool. You must learn to sharpen it." He picked up one of the vials of smoke. "Now, hold out your hand." Alec held out his hand. It did not tremble. Alistair uncorked the vial, and the liquid smoke within did not drift out. It poured, a heavy, coiling ribbon that settled into Alec's palm. It was cold, but not unpleasantly so. It felt like holding a handful of midnight. "Do not try to contain it," Alistair instructed, his voice a low monotone. "Simply observe its movement. Your emotional state will dictate its behavior. Try to remember a moment of pure, uncomplicated joy from your time with the child." Alec closed his eyes. He sifted through the memories, now knowing they were an illusion, a script written for him to perform. He found one. The weight of the small, warm body against his chest. The smell of milk and clean skin. A feeling of such profound rightness it had felt like the universe clicking into place. The smoke in his hand began to pulse with a soft, golden light, and it coiled into a perfect, tranquil sphere. "Good," Alistair murmured. "Now, the moment you realized it was gone, the shift was instantaneous. The golden sphere shattered. The smoke turned a deep, bruised purple and lashed against his skin like a trapped eel, seeking an escape it would never find. The cold became a biting, personal frost that seeped into his veins. "Control it," Alistair said. "Do not suppress the feeling. Channel it, shape it." It was the hardest thing Alec had ever done. He let the grief wash through him, the raw, screaming truth of his loss. But he did not let it consume him. He imagined it as a river, and he was building a dam, not to stop the flow, but to harness its power. Slowly, erratically, the frantic lashing of the smoke began to still. It formed a complex angular shape in his palm, a crystalline structure of pure sorrow, dark and glittering. Alistair gave another of his thin, non-existent smiles. "Adequate for a first attempt. That shape is a ward of mourning. It would make any lesser spirit of despair turn away, for it would recognize a master. This is your work now, Alec. Your feelings are no longer your own. They are the bricks and mortar of this place. You learn to build." He recaptured the smoke with a flick of his wrist and a soft, sibilant word, returning it to its vial. The lesson was over. He packed his briefcase and walked to the door without another word, leaving Alec standing in the living room, his hand still tingling with the ghost of that structured grief. From that day, Alistair's visits became a regular part of Alice's new routine. He never came at the same time, and he never announced his arrival. He would simply appear, deliver a lesson on the properties of thresholds, or the taxonomy of unseen things. or the correct pronunciation of words that made the air taste of ozone. And then he would leave. Alec learned to differentiate between the silence of an empty house and the silence that preceded Alistair's arrival. The latter had a density to it, a quality of held breath. He practiced. He learned to shape his loneliness into a quiet shield around the property. He learned to temper his residual, human fear into a sharp blade of alertness. The rattle on the nursery sill was his primary tool, a tuning fork for realities. He would hold it and project a feeling, and the frost on its surface would shift and change, showing him the effect his emotional state was having on the stability of the gate. One evening, during a lesson on dreamwalking and its dangers, Alistair paused. He looked toward the front window, his head cocked. "You have a visitor. The woman with the cat. She is standing at the edge of the property. She has been there for 13 minutes. Alec had not heard or seen anything. He followed Alistair's gaze and, concentrating, felt her presence. A small, nervous knot of gratitude and lingering fear, held at bay by the wards of quiet loneliness he had erected. "She wishes to give you a gift," Alistair said. "A token of thanks. You will accept it. Such exchanges strengthen the local network. But be discerning. Not all gifts are what they seem." Alistair faded into the shadows of the hall and was gone. Alec walked to the front door and opened it. The woman, whose name he still did not know, jumped. She was holding a small, cloth-wrapped bundle. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I didn't want to disturb you. Jasper came back. Just like you said. And different. Better." She held out the bundle. "It's bread. I baked it." Alec took it. The cloth was warm. He could feel the simple, wholesome goodness of the gesture, the intent behind it. It felt like a small, bright sun in his hands. "Thank you," he said. She nodded, a tear tracing a path down her cheek, though she was smiling. Then she turned and hurried away into the twilight. Alec brought the bread inside. He unwrapped it. It was a simple loaf, still warm, its crust golden. He broke a piece off. It was the most delicious thing he had ever tasted. It was not enchanted, not in the way of the rattle or the smoke. It was just bread, made by a human being for another, a tiny, defiant act of normal kindness, in the shadow of the impossible. He ate it slowly, savoring every crumb, and for the first time since the reservoir, he felt a flicker of something that was not grief, or duty, or fear. It was a simple human comfort, and he understood that this too was part of the balance. It was a different kind of magic, and it was just as necessary. The following week, the bread was gone, but the memory of its taste lingered, a persistent echo of warmth in the cool, charged air of the house. Alec found himself thinking of the woman, not as a subject or a node in the network, but as a person. He realized he had never asked her name. This felt like an oversight, a breach in a different kind of protocol. Alistair returned on a day of soft, persistent rain. He noted the change in Alec immediately. "You are integrating the mundane," he stated, hanging his dry coat on a hook that had not been there a moment before. "This is expected. It is also a vulnerability. Attachment to the local context can cloud your perception of the larger picture." "The larger picture being what, exactly?" Alec asked, his voice calm. He was standing by the nursery door, feeling the subtle hum of the rattle through the wood. "The maintenance of equilibrium," Alistair said, opening his briefcase to reveal new instruments. These ones of carved bone and silver wire. This city, this world is one of many. They press against each other, and where the fabric is thin, gates form. Some are natural, fleeting things. Others, like this one, are cultivated, tended. They serve a purpose. They are valves, pressure release points. Your wife's bloodline were master valve makers. We are the engineers who ensure they do not fail." He held up a bone needle threaded with silver. "Today we will map the extent of your influence. The bread giver's gratitude has created a sympathetic link. We will use it to see how far your resonance now reaches." The procedure was not painful, but it was deeply invasive. Alistair used the needle to trace patterns on Alec's forearm, and with each line, Alec's awareness expanded. He could feel the woman, whose name he now knew was Clara, in her house 2 streets over. The unique signature of her relief, a small, steady flame. He felt her cat, Jasper, a creature now thrumming with a quiet, otherworldly awareness, a tiny guardian of its own minor threshold, the space under Clara's back porch. And he felt others, flickers in the twilight of the city. An old man who tended a garden where the roses bloomed a color not found in nature. A young boy who drew intricate, impossible blueprints in his notebook, his mind brushing against geometries from the city of spirals Alec had glimpsed. They were all connected, a scattered, unconscious congregation. And his house was their silent spire. "The network is stable," Alistair pronounced, wiping the silver residue from the needle. "But it is fragile. Your predecessor understood the necessity of distance. Audrey maintained a cordial isolation. You are leaning toward connection. This is a risk." "Is it?" Alec looked out the window at the rain-slicked street. "You said my feelings are the bricks and mortar." Loneliness was a good brick. "But it's not the only one. What about compassion?" Alistair's gaze was impenetrable. "Compassion is a solvent. It can weaken structures as easily as it can bind them. It is unpredictable. Your grief is a reliable, solid thing. Your compassion is a wild card." He closed his briefcase with a definitive click. "The next lesson will be on binding agents. We will use regret. I trust you have a sufficient supply." He left, leaving Alec alone with the map of his new parish etched invisibly onto his skin. That night, Alec did not practice with the rattle. Instead, he sat in his chair and focused on the feeling of the warm bread in his hands, the look on Clara's face. He pushed that feeling out, not as a shield or a blade, but as a gentle, radiating wave. He did not know what if anything, it would do. But he knew that a house built only on grief and duty was a fortress, and he was no longer sure his role was to be a fortress keeper. He was a warden, yes, but perhaps a warden could also be a neighbor. The silence in the house seemed to listen, and for the first time, it did not feel like a congregation awaiting a sermon, but like a companion considering a new idea.